Chapter 2. Elder Athanasios of Grigoriou. Who was the blessed Athanasios of Grigoriou? I will answer only this. If I were a hagiographer and were given the task of writing about some saint whose life is unknown, I would write about the holy hieromonk Athanasios. About his tall, upright stature, his frail, delicate body, his peaceful countenance, his manner of speaking, his bright, radiant eyes, the deep peace of his holy, dispassionate soul, which was reflected in his face, his manly love and gentle strictness with his sons, and lastly, about the spiritual light which shone in his entire holy person. Monk Theoklitos of Dionysiou. 1. Calling to monasticism. 1. His childhood years. About 100 years ago, the future Athonite hieromonk Athanasios was born in Pygros of Ilias, far from Mount Athos. He was favored of God in being born to a pious family numbering 11 children, a number not unusual for Greek families of the time. His father passed most of his time in one of the churches in the city, in which he served as a sexton. One often saw his small children under the domes of the church, especially Andrew, Father Athanasios' name in the world, who delighted in being with his father in church. It happens all too often that one who serves in the church becomes bored with it and forsakes the high standards of spiritual life. Andrew's father, however, was an exception. He kept lit within himself the flame of his faith and his love for God, and he managed to instill it also in his children, especially in Andrew. Within the sacred atmosphere of the church, the innocent young soul of Andrew experienced its first holy stirrings. What grace-filled childish prayers he made during Orthos in the morning twilight, and in the evening as he slowly lit the lampada in the altar before the crucified one. And at the liturgies, what boundless joy he felt, dressed in his sticarion and serving the priest. The church had become his second home. 2. The voice of God. It seems that the longing for the monastic life was born in Andrew from his study of the writings of the Holy Church Fathers. He loved to read the lives of the Holy Fathers, and the books of St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. These were about the only religious books then in circulation in Greece. These were the first books he read as a child, and they lifted his young soul on high. The miracles and spiritual ascents of the Holy Fathers carried him away. The deep thoughts and divine feelings contained in the writings of St. Nicodemus mastered his mind and stirred his young heart. Without his understanding why, some mysterious voice began to be heard inside him, calling him to something high and lofty. It told him that he was being chosen for a higher life, an angelic one. He wanted to resemble those holy men, bound and yet free, held but not restrained, who are in no wise of the world, but in all things above the world, who are of earth and yet of heaven. St. Gregory the theologian, who appeared so forcibly in his young mind, that voice which became ever stronger in his soul was the voice of God. Andrew believed that God was calling him to follow a separate path, one that was slowly plotted in him with great clarity. Nothing remained but the fearsome start. That beginning was to support all the rich fruits of his spiritual life, at which later we would all marvel. 3. A courageous decision. It was the summer of 1891, the last week of July. The days were sunny and clear when 3 young souls set out in search of a pure and enlightened life. There was much talk and many tears shed when it was learned that the 3 young men had left their homes. Andrew and his 2 friends had abandoned Pygros without saying a word to anyone, and they were going far away. In their souls' eyes, majestic Mount Athos overshadowed everything. The holy mountain was calling them to her, and they journeyed to meet her with youthful enthusiasm. How they longed to arrive there, and to satisfy all their spiritual desires. Even the fact that Mount Athos was then under Turkish rule failed to daunt their divine zeal. After many hardships, they finally reached Volos. From there they could continue the road by land, but they hesitated because of the difficulties they might encounter at the Turkish frontier, and therefore they chose to go by sea. They needed to find a boat, But in those days there were none going to Mount Athos. They didn't want to remain in Volos, so they made a courageous decision to sail their own boat to the holy mountain. 4. A sea adventure. The necessary arrangements were made with the owner of the boat, and the 4 young people journeyed by boat from the Pagasetic Gulf past the island of Skiathos and continued into the Aegean Sea. Should they sail close to land or across the open sea? The first alternative meant a longer route, but the second exposed them to greater dangers. They decided on the fastest route. They headed out into the Aegean and north to Mount Athos. When the wind was favorable, the boat sailed well. When it died down, however, they had to use oars. Their main worry was bad weather, which unfortunately they were not spared. One problem after another plagued them. A contrary wind, cold, rain, and the worst, a storm at sea. Though foreseen, the difficulties delayed them greatly, and the food began to run out. They were in danger of dying from hunger. In the face of all these difficulties, their bodily strength began to weaken. Their physical exhaustion made it difficult to row when there was no wind. The boat sat motionless. "We can't continue our journey with this kind of weather," the captain said. "The water is gone, and almost all our provisions also. I have no desire to leave my bones in the Aegean." "Let's turn back," Andrew's 2 friends said. "Under these conditions, it's impossible to continue." But Andrew was in no way swayed from his purpose, even in this critical situation. He was firm in his decision, and had unwavering faith that God would help them in their difficulties and guide them to their destination. What do the Scriptures say? "If God be for us, who can be against us?" Romans 8:31. That saying was especially dear to him. It was often on his lips throughout his life, as the fathers of Mount Athos tell us. Our Lady the Theotokos, who is the harbor of our life at sea, and whose Dormition was approaching, would hear their supplications and grant them to reach her holy garden. They would arrive there or die. "We will not turn back," he told them boldly. "We must have courage. Let's continue our labor a little longer. It won't be long before we arrive. God will help us." And indeed he did. In a little while a strong wind came up, and the boat began to fly, sailing straight for Mount Athos. On the 17th day she sailed into the harbor in front of the monastery of Grigoriou. St. Nicholas, to whom the holy monastery is dedicated, had heard the supplications of the exhausted group and wrought the miracle. They beheld a monastery of Mount Athos. Was it true? They couldn't believe it. No words could describe their emotion. Their trials were ending, and their dreams would soon become reality. "Glory to thee, Lord, for the love that thou hast shown us. Thou didst not desert us in the end. We thank thee with all our souls," the 3 youths said over and over. Now they could pay the captain and deliver themselves into the arms of the holy mountain. But a temptation appeared at the last moment to disturb them. The harbor master, a monk, heard cries and tumult. What was happening on the boat? The captain was demanding more money, for he felt the amount they had agreed on was too little. He threatened to take them back if he didn't receive more money. "Help, Father, help! Come and help us!" they shouted to the harbor master. The harbor master sailed out to their boat. "Either you let the boys land, or I shall deliver you to the Turkish authorities," the monk shouted at the captain. The intervention of the monk, who was strong and muscular, had results. The captain was forced to let the youths off on the deck and take only the money that they had agreed on. And so this new temptation passed. 5. An unexpected temptation. August 15th. The festival of the Mother of God. That was the day they arrived at the garden of the Theotokos. The moment they stepped on the earth of the holy mountain, Andrew and his friends knelt and kissed the ground, the blessed earth which one day would cover him when he bade farewell to this present life. With holy fear, they continued to the monastery court, marveling at the cells, the balconies, the domes, and all the buildings. They prayed in the catholicon of the monastery, especially to their guardian and benefactor, St. Nicholas. They were in awe of the magnificent iconostasis. They kissed the holy relics. Full of joy, they retired to the guest chamber, where a room, food, water, and rest awaited them, all of which they very much longed for after the 17-day odyssey. Andrew could hardly hide his joy as he lay on his bed to rest. He thought that all his trials had ended, and all would be peaceful. He never suspected the temptation that lay in wait for him. One of his friends, who was a hot-blooded type and full of life, thought he saw an opportunity to express his youthful high spirits, which for many days he'd held back. He became unruly and playful, started joking and shouting. He wouldn't let the others rest. Worse than that, his pranks disturbed the fathers of the holy monastery. In the orderly and strict monastery, the young man's behavior was completely unacceptable, and the abbot was forced to order their immediate expulsion from the monastery. Who could remain unmoved in such a situation? Outside the monastery, by the sea, the three boys lived through a terrible time. Great was their sorrow, and they cried without ceasing. Andrew went off alone, and with great pain in his heart he knelt to pray. Holy St. Nicholas, save us, help us, don't forsake us, have pity on us, and move the abbot to accept us again, he prayed with tears. For Andrew it was unthinkable to seek another monastery. He had an inner feeling that he must stay where God first put him. There he meant to live, and there to die. "What's going on there? What's this I see?" came the deep voice of Elder Victor, who happened to be passing by. Elder Victor, the secretary of the monastery, was unfamiliar with the circumstances of the strange spectacle he encountered. "How did you get here, boys? What has happened that you look so troubled? Why are you crying?" "Father, save us. We cannot describe what has happened, all the difficulties and misfortunes that have struck us," they told him with tears. Elder Victor learned all the details of their predicament, the trip from Pygros to Volos, their sea adventure of 17 days, how they arrived at the monastery, and how they were told to leave. He was astonished and greatly moved. When he had calmed the boys, without delay he ran to the abbot and gave him a detailed account of all that he had learned. "Holy Elder," he said, "I beg you to receive them again. Examine which of the three was to blame, and have compassion on the other two." When the abbot learned of their desire for monastic life, their heroic resolve and efforts, and all the trials they'd passed through, he was deeply moved. Overlooking the childish pranks, he gave orders that all three be welcomed back to the monastery. And that is how they overcame that trial. Aware of the fearful and unbelievable temptations that come to all those who seek to give themselves fully to God, they returned to the monastery full of joy, and with the resolve to deliver themselves to the Lord. Chapter 2, Elder Athanasios of Grigoriou continued. Part 2, A Monk on Mount Athos. 1. The New Arena. We will leave the other two youths for now, since we have little information regarding them. Instead, we will pursue the gentle and zealous young man, Andrew Proto-Europoulos, that was his surname, who disembarked from the boat in 1891 at the harbor of Grigoriou Monastery, beginning a heroic chapter in the book of his life. When Andrew entered the courtyard of the monastery, he crossed himself and asked God to grant him to remain there until his last breath. He saw the difficult cenobitic life as a battleground on which he had to fight in order to win heaven and bring it down into his heart. The road ahead of him was narrow and tortuous, but it led him surely to holiness and deification. The stadium of the monastic struggle beckoned him to victory. In those struggles, the young Andrew, he was 17 years old at the time, divested himself of all earthly consolation. His warm family, his good father, his affectionate mother, his 8 brothers, with their love and happiness were far, far away. All this he'd given up because of his love for God. He renounced the world and all that is in the world, as St. Basil the Great says. Now his heart, his mind, his desires were surrendered to the monastery and to his elder in God. The elder of Grigoriou Monastery at that time was an exceptional man named Father Simeon. He had come from the holy monastery of St. Paul and was originally from Tripoli in the Peloponnesus. He had many natural gifts, great virtues, and deep faith. He was direct, honest, sincere, distinguished, and extremely energetic. It is impossible to measure the amount of labor that he and his monks endured in constructing necessary buildings in that holy monastery. Let us just note this. In order to carry rocks up to the monastery, they made wooden saddles for their backs. There was not any modern machinery then, and the monastery, which had many debts, was in dire need of funds. With indomitable patience and superhuman labor, the abbot put everything in order. So indispensable was he that God kept him as abbot for 46 years, from 1859 to 1905. Because of his great virtue and many sacrifices after his death, his bones, his holy relics were fragrant. Between the elder and his disciple there existed an informal agreement. Andrew was to be completely obedient to the elder and to the elder monks, even if to his small mind certain things seemed difficult or senseless. In return, the elder was to lead him safely in this life in the wisdom of God and holiness, and in the future life he was to prepare a place for him, close to the throne of God. Among the 144,000 of the Apocalypse and those redeemed from the earth. Revelations 14:3. Well, that mystical agreement between them also involved another, the contract for which would be made later in a formal ceremony in the Katholikon, in front of all the brethren. 2. A novice monk. Andrew's desire and resolve to be clothed in the monastic schema had to pass through a trial period. For 2 years he would remain in the rank of a novice monk, during which period it would be decided if he was worthy to become a fully tonsured monk. There were many difficulties in those years. He passed through practically all the obediences of the monastery, and each time he was in subjection to those in charge of that obedience. He suffered much. He bore patiently with the harsh characters of certain of the brothers. He accepted repeated rebukes, which often fell on him like rain, one after the other. For one as young, delicate, and sensitive as Andrew, there were many things that were fatiguing, but he could act no differently. It was not painless to be transplanted from the hothouse of a family to the harsh fields of monastic life. Everyone helped him in his efforts to adapt himself to his new life, everyone from the abbot to the lowest brother, according to their own way and knowledge. But he also had supports in his daily struggle. The first of these was his revered elder, his father on the earth. For he is a true father, who first is a father to all, and second is a leader in the spiritual life, St. Basil the Great. To his elder he brought his thoughts, his problems, doubts, and difficulties, and he found relief. His elder's love and discretion were a strong foundation for his first steps in the monastic life. His cell was another consolation. Quiet and undistracted, he lived in the beauty of the spiritual world. Several holy icons that adorned his cell spoke to his soul. He treasured the writings of the Holy Fathers, which aided and strengthened him. There were so many saintly men, many hundreds of years before, had traveled the same road, and now came to help him. He never tired of reading the wise words of St. John Callinicus. Trees shaken by the wind drive their roots deep into the earth. Similarly, those living in obedience acquire strong and unshakable souls. And from St. Theodore the Studite, he learned that monastic life is a continuous war, incessant war with the invisible enemy. In his stall, his stacidi in the church, he experienced moments of heaven, moments when his mind was filled with the fragrance of the prayers and the psalms, the canons and the synaxarion, the kathismata and the acathists, the midnight services, nightly vespers and compline, the joyful vigils of feasts, and the great liturgies concelebrated with many priests, the slow Byzantine chanting, the chanting of the canonarchs, the many-toned hymns to the Mother of God. In these moments he felt that heaven descended into the church. The holy icons that adorned the iconostasis, the walls, ceiling, the icon stands, as well as many grace-filled icons of the Theotokos, looked down into his heart and filled him with spiritual joy and peace. When he reverently kissed the monastery's holy relics, there were relics of St. Anastasia the Roman, St. Gregory the Theologian, and the holy unmercenary Damian, St. Pantaleimon, etc. He came in living contact with those heroes and martyrs of Christ, and he was not a little strengthened. More than anything else, he felt unspeakable joy as the day approached when he would be granted communion of the body and blood of Christ, for whose love he had forsaken everything. And that is how the novice monk was strengthened spiritually and rooted deeply into the field where God had planted him. 3. His tonsure. Andrew passed through the trials of his novitiate successfully. His conduct justified the elder of the monastery in granting him the tonsure. Thus, having lived 2 years in the monastery, he was informed by his elder that the day was approaching when he would be made a monk. This news filled him with joy. Shortly, he would wear the angelic schema, a high honor. Retiring from his obediences for a few days, he prepared for that great event. In the stillness of his cell, in study and in prayer, he waited for the great moment with much longing, counting the remaining hours. Reading the service of the tonsure to the great schema, he was moved to tears. The promises he would give would be written down by the angels in heaven, and someday God would ask for an account of them. The night before his tonsure, he went to the elder, and he made his last confession as a novice. He received the elder's blessing and his wise counsels. As is the custom on Mount Athos, he did not sleep that night, but kept vigil, praying. The service of the tonsure was performed in an atmosphere of contrition and joy. He formally received his monastic consecration, and his confession was inscribed in the book of heaven. Dressed in the many-crossed angelic schema and cowl, he held in his hand a candle and a cross, and received with tears the blessings of the fathers. "What do you call yourself, brother?" they asked him according to the accepted form. "Monk Athanasios," he answered in a shaking voice. All the fathers rejoiced in this event because they had truly loved and respected him for his exceptional conduct during the 2-year trial period. And the angels in heaven also most certainly exulted in the tonsure of Father Athanasios. 4. At the Metochian in Karies. Every one of the 20 large monasteries of Mount Athos has a Metochian in Karies, the capital of Mount Athos, the village of monks, where a monk resides who represents his monastery at the Holy Council. The representative of the monastery lives together with a younger monk charged with the care of the Metochian. The obedience of the Metochian was the first duty the newly tonsured monk was assigned. In keeping with the canons of the monastery, Father Athanasios, having no beard, had to live outside the monastery. Thus, in 1893, we see him living in the Metochian together with the representative of the monastery, the elder James. Father Athanasios would spend 11 years with this elder. What was the character and life of Father Iakovos? He was a monk in every sense of the word. He had learned and lived monastic life in the strictest and truest sense. As gold in the furnace, or rather in a community, the Lord has tried them, as St. John Callinicus writes. He was in a position to similarly try the new monk. With his keen inward eye, Elder Iakovos discerned the strong soul of Father Athanasios, and he exercised him like a good trainer. Although the elder loved him very much, he tried not to show it. He wanted to appear hard. He never talked to him gently and never laughed. He never called him by his name. He wanted to keep him at a distance so as not to give him boldness, because boldness and familiarity are death to a monk, according to the Holy Fathers. Familiarity breeds contempt. In a harsh tone, the elder ordered Father Athanasios to care for the garden, the buildings, and the inside of the Metochian, all by himself. Most of the time, the elder was critical of his work. He did not allow Father Athanasios to become familiar with others in the village of Karies, With those that visited the cottage, he was silent, and very often he would be called by the elder disobedient, self-willed, unfit for work, and so on. Because he was tall and thin in body, he was ridiculed in front of strangers, and called, among other things, earthworm. He is good for nothing, Elder Iakovos would say. He is an egotist. He is unfit for the life of the monk. Those monks who had entered a monastery at a young age and had thus preserved the purity of their lives, the fathers would, as a rule, prepare for the diaconate or for the priesthood, but Elder Iakovos never encouraged such thoughts in Father Athanasios. You, with your egotism, will never receive the orarion, he would say. As a member of the Council of Elders, he would add that they would never accept the idea of making him a priest. And Father Athanasios, bowing humbly with his hand on his chest, would answer in a gentle voice, "May it be blessed, Elder." The hard physical labor, the long services, the fasting that made him so thin, being rebuked and scolded in front of strangers, the lack of human consolation, all these things he endured patiently as gifts sent from God for the perfecting of his soul. He bore it all with patience. And Elder Iakovos, seeing him always responding so meekly, welcoming the hard trials so silently and humbly, and hearing him say, "May it be blessed, Elder," time after time, rejoiced inwardly. In order to endure this difficult life, Father Athanasios had to completely trust the teachings of the Holy Fathers on the spiritual life. They were the foundations for the dwelling that God was building for himself within Father Athanasios' soul. His beloved patristic texts armed him spiritually for every affliction and trial. He believed God wanted him to toil and to fight. With a fearless soul he daily recited the psalm for the third hour. "For the sake of the words of thy lips have I kept the ways that are hard." 5. A bee gathering spiritual nectar. What a blessed thing it is to read spiritual books. They can cool and refresh one's whole life. Father Athanasios had loved to study from his youth, and here on Mount Athos, with its treasury of spiritual books, they were his companions during every free moment. He sought out the most beautiful flowers in their meadows to make the loveliest bouquets. He gave himself to this task from his first days on Mount Athos. From all the patristic, ascetical, and theological books, he chose the most inspiring passages and inscribed them in his own personal notebook. That blessed pastime continued into great old age. We saw his handwritten notes in the hands of many of the monks of Grigoriou. We discovered in them a rich variety. Next to ascetic texts, there are important events of church history. Next to patristic writings, there are sayings of ancient sages. Besides teachings from the lives of the saints, there are important canons of ecclesiastical law and stories about the world of ancient Greece, and so on. Here are a few examples from the collection. Quote, "Since you are mortal, don't consider yourself immortal. And not even the little birds fall down to the ground without God's will. We should always say to God, 'Thy will be done.'" The Blessed Augustine was much instructed by the stories about St. Anthony the Great and the ascetics of Egypt. "What is this?" he would ask his friend Alypius. "What did you hear?" "Well, the ignorant rise up and seize heaven, and we, behold how we, with our heartless science, wallow in flesh and blood." And the power of the iron sword was not given to the church, but the power of the spiritual sword, wherein lies the word of God. And Pythagoras was never persuaded to eat fish, because by physical nature they are silent and symbolic of silence, which he considered a divine and heavenly gift. The spirits of the chosen seek seclusion, and they flee from the assembly of many men. Justinian founded and established Hagia Sophia on the mouth of the well on which Christ sat. And write your enmity on the water. And there are 5 baptisms. First is Moses, when the Hebrews passed over the Red Sea. Second, that of the Holy Forerunner and Baptist John. Third, that of our Lord Jesus Christ, without which baptism one is not a Christian. Fourth, martyrdom, baptism in blood. Christ suffered that baptism. And fifth, the baptism of tears, which comes from the remembrance of one's sins. And bind your will to the will of God, and all things will happen as you wish. And at the Skete of Arai, St. Gregory Palamas would spend 5 days of the week closeted in his cell, not allowing others to enter it. Only on Saturdays and Sundays did he leave to celebrate the holy mysteries and to converse spiritually. And, O my God, the apostle justly says to thee that, if any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man. James 3:2. Lay thy bridle on me, Lord, and curb my tongue with thy grace, that I may speak only whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report. Philippians 4:8. Part 3, upon a candlestand. 1. At the holy altar. In 1904, after 11 years, Elder James and Father Athanasios left Kyrios and returned to the monastery. How rich was Father Athanasios when he returned! The tree of his soul, tossed hither and thither by the wind, had grown deep roots. The branches were filled with fruit. After so many labors, God granted him his most precious gifts. Without knowing anything about it beforehand, he was told by the abbot to prepare himself for ordination. They had been informed at the monastery during his years of absence of his spiritual progress, and with great joy they had decided to ordain him a deacon. The one most moved in spirit by his ordination was Elder James. Father Athanasios received the warmest blessings from him. If in the past he had discouraged him from any thoughts of the priesthood, it was only out of love. The following year, Elder James was elevated to the rank of abbot. He was indeed worthy to ascend the throne of the abbot. Deacon Athanasios was given the obediences of assisting at the liturgy and of guest master. His presence at the divine liturgy and the guest house radiated the grace of God upon every visitor. His discretion, piety, and virtue impressed everyone. In 1908, at the age of 34, he was ordained a priest. With sacred fear he embraced the holy altar, devoting himself forever to his priestly duties. His labors in patience and asceticism bore much fruit. Adorned with the divine grace of the priesthood, he began a new period of his life, which would continue until he reached the heavenly altar. He never ceased, however, to be a humble monk. Even though he was honored with the high calling of the priesthood, he continued to be very humble, wise, full of patience and gentleness, full of grace before God and man. Let us make note of this. He regarded the priesthood with such piety and fear that when he later became abbot and tonsured some 27 monastics, he never dared to allow anyone to advance to the holy altar. He constantly kept in mind the saying, "Better with a prayer rope in paradise than an epitrachelion in Hades." 2. A meeting. The family of Father Athanasios had lost track of him for years. Eventually, one of his brothers, who was an officer and had the rank of major, was informed that his brother was in the monastery of Grigoriou on Mount Athos. Without delay, he set out to meet him. When he arrived at Grigoriou, he learned from the other fathers that his brother was far away in a metochian of the monastery. "We lost him as a child and could find no information of where he had gone. Now that I have found where he is and come here to meet him, he is gone," said the man to the fathers. "Isn't there a way I can go to that metochian?" The metochian where Father Athanasios was living was on the west side of the small middle peninsula of Halkidiki, near the village of Balambani, now New Marmara. The fathers took pity on him and gave him directions on how to get there. In the meantime, they sent a message ahead to Father Athanasios and Elder Ananias, the steward, that the brother was coming. The scene which transpired reveals the courageous soul of Father Athanasios. "Father Athanasios, your brother has come. Run and greet him," they told him. But he seemed to feel little emotion at the news. Sternly he said, "I renounced them all for the love of God. My brothers now are they who are in this monastery. I have no other brothers." By the intervention of Elder Ananias, however, and by his patient entreaties, Father Athanasios was forced to yield, receive his brother for a short time. The brother, who had heard the praises of Father Athanasios at the monastery, was shaken to tears when he saw him in front of him. "My brother, my beloved brother, I've found you at last after so many years. I was a small boy when you left home. We thought you were lost," he told him with great emotion, unable to control his feelings. "In God's plan I was to walk a separate path. It was meant that I conform to the will of God and abandon the world," Father Athanasios answered with peace in his voice. The officer reminded him of the past, his parents, brothers and sisters, his relatives. He told them what they had all thought when they found he was alive and on Mount Athos, about his sufferings until he could meet him and his desire to visit him again. He was speechless, however, when he heard Father Athanasios tell him firmly in his humble voice, "Brother, please, let this be the first and last time you visit me. I have died to the world." Luke 14:26. When he heard these words, the officer wept like a small child. However, he marveled at the courage and the steadfastness of Father Athanasios. What a strong soul, what greatness of renunciation, even of his most beloved people. "Let it be so, brother. I only beg you to take a small gift to remember me by. I will take it, and I will not cease to pray that God will enlighten and save you." With great pain of soul, his brother bade him farewell and left forever. 3. The locust swarm. In the village of Vulitia, which is in the coastal area, Grigoriou monastery had a metokion which it had bought in 1857 from a certain Turkish bey. One time the steward, very upset, sought for help from the monastery. He requested that they send him a devout priest and holy relics. A terrible evil had struck that flat region of the country. Countless armies of locusts were spreading destruction and threatening to devastate everything in sight. The monastery council decided to send help immediately. The holy relics were prepared, among which were those of the holy martyr Anastasia the Roman. The monastery had no hero monk to send more pious than Father Athanasios, and he, accustomed to obedience, made a prostration to the abbot, prayed, received the blessings of the fathers, and set off to do battle against the natural disaster in that village. When Father Athanasios arrived, he was greatly pained by the catastrophe, seeing the damage being done by the swarm of locusts. With evident anguish, the villagers were begging God to have compassion on them. They had no other hope. Joyfully they welcomed the help of the monastery, fervently kissing the holy relics and the hand of the hero monk from Mount Athos, by whom they were immediately impressed. Father prayed to God that he might make a miracle. They implored him with tears. The situation allowed no delay. Armed with the strength of his faith, Father Athanasios donned his epitrachelion and began sprinkling with holy water. Praying together with him were the saints, whose relics he was carrying. So many times in his life he had shown obedience to God. Would not God now be obedient to his earnest supplications? In the deathly silence that gripped the multitude of stricken Orthodox, the steadfast, majestic voice of Father Athanasios could be clearly heard. "Do not condemn the land, nor the vineyard, nor the garden, nor the fruitful or fruitless tree, or the green leaf, but go away, depart from our land." While the villagers crossed themselves, Father Athanasios proceeded to the fields, carrying the holy relics in his hands. The people were in an agony of fear and suspense. This assistance from Mount Athos was their last hope. Would this hero monk do anything with his saints and prayers? But it was not long before their desperation was changed into great joy. As Father Athanasios with the holy relics continued walking through the fields, The swarm of locusts, as if smitten by some invisible power, began to leave and fly far away. Shortly afterward, the sea around them became unrecognizable, strewn with millions of drowned locusts. The region was saved from that horrible pestilence. Never had the place seen such exultation, tears of joy, and kissings of hands that followed. But that which transpired a few days later in the harbor of Grigoriou Monastery surpasses all description. In a splendid procession, with incense, banners, and fans, the fathers welcomed Father Athanasios with unprecedented emotion. They received him like a Roman general triumphantly returning to Rome after defeating the barbarians. It is worth noting that even today, many decades later, this event is still remembered by the fathers with tearful emotion. 4. Abbot. In 1914, 6 years after Father Athanasios' ordination to the priesthood, he was offered the abbacy. He was neither carried away by the honor, nor did he oppose it. "Let us wait a decade," was his answer, "and then we'll see." In the meantime, aside from his daily duties, he also had the obedience of librarian, as well as baking prosphora for Holy Communion. Usually this obedience is given to monks leading attentive lives. The 10 years passed, and that which he had foreseen came to be. Whether he wished it or not, he was elected abbot. Without contradicting, he accepted the will of the brothers, which was also the will of God. All the fathers rejoiced at the event. He who was most worthy was now at the head of the monastery. Assuming the leadership of the monastery, Father Athanasios fully understood the greatness of his responsibility. Now, aside from his own struggles to cultivate and train himself, he had to take care for the guidance of the brothers. All the brothers, without exception, had to live their monastic lives as perfectly as possible. To accomplish this, he anticipated a difficult struggle. He aspired and strove to be an example for all the monks to imitate, and he accomplished this, setting before himself as a model the philosophy of obedience to all. As Theodoret of Cyrus would say, "The more negligent monks found in him a firm helper, and the diligent a co-struggler. With exceptional kindness he received all the fathers and listened to their thoughts and problems with unfailing concern. His responses were wise, and he was able to find suitable solutions for all difficulties. The struggles, weaknesses, and temptations of the brethren were also his own problems. One time a monk, Father Y, refused to undertake a certain obedience. Father Athanasios said nothing. He met this sad occurrence with calmness and patience, and he won. As soon as daybreak came, Father Y came to him, repentant. "Elder, forgive me for what I did." His conscience had been condemning him for his disobedience, and he had not been able to sleep from remorse. The abbot, as he usually did in such circumstances, answered, "Is that what Christ says? Is this how he told us to behave?" After a moment he continued, "Be always obedient. If an obedience is tiresome and difficult, then remember our Lord in his sufferings." Another time a certain monk, Father B, who happened to have a hot temper and a nervous character, for no reason, created a great scene in the monastery. The sweet and gentle Father Athanasios, looking out for the interest of the entire monastery, used harsh words. "I am going to order you to be tied up." The monk became quite enraged and behaved toward the abbot in an improper and unbecoming way. Father Athanasios' soul was grieved by the brother's fall, and without saying anything he retired to his office. When the monastery council was informed of this event, they asked that Father B be punished as an example to others and expelled from the monastery. Such conduct is unpardonable in a Cenobitic monastery. However, they came up against the abbot's forbearance and love. "If you make such a decision, I will not sign it," he told them. In other circumstances, he was wont to say, "The abbot is a father to the monks, and in their moments of weakness he must stand by their side." Father Athanasios took especially great care over worship in church. This area received his particular attention. Whatever is done for God, he would often say, must be done in the most perfect and dignified manner. He wanted everything in church to be worthy of God, to whom the worship is addressed. He was exceedingly particular about its cleanliness and adornment. The church had to shine. A certain old ecclesiarch told us the story. Because it was my obedience, I regularly cleaned the church, and I tried to put it in order as well as I could. On occasion, the ever-memorable abbot would visit me, and seeing my diligence would say, "Bless, O Lord, those who love the beauty of thy house." When he gently and joyfully spoke these words in supplication, I would feel indescribably moved. It would be difficult to restrain my tears. He also wanted the vestments of the priests celebrating the liturgy to be majestic. "You who have been vouchsafed to be the stewards of the holy mysteries," he would say to the priests, "must during the divine liturgy present yourselves spotless, attentive, seemly, and wearing bright vestments." During the all-night vigils and the great feasts, he would sit on his throne wearing his abbot's mantia and holding his staff. He gave a very solemn and festive tone to the services. In general, the order and cleanliness which were traditional in Grigoriou monastery were enforced even more strictly during Father Athanasios' abbacy. Both to the church services and to the other areas of monastic life he gave a spirit of solemnity and deep seriousness. Sobriety, as they say, was in his blood. At mealtime in the refectory he had the habit of never letting his eyes roam to the right or left, but looking only straight ahead. Only once would he raise his eyes, to reassure himself that the fathers had finished their meal and to give the signal for rising. He never entered the monastery courtyard without wearing his rasa. He never allowed his lips to speak jestingly or use unnecessary words. All his movements, actions, and encounters had weight and seriousness. Before giving an order, he gave it long and careful thought. Once he had given it, however, he never retracted it. On Sundays there were 2 readings in the church, according to the Athonite typicon. The first came between the canon to the Trinity and the 6 Psalms, and the other after the second kathisma of the Psalter. The first reading was by the abbot, and the second by the serving priest. When Father Athanasios performed the first reading, he read so beautifully, so solemnly, and compunctionately that all were deeply moved. It was a rare spiritual treat. They all rejoiced to see and hear him, and to enjoy together with him the meaning of the sermons of the Sunday Gospels. Father Athanasios was also distinguished for his industry. Both as a novice in the Metochian at Kyrios and now as abbot, he was an exemplary worker. During the common labors, he inspired everyone with zeal for work. Even after he had resigned his abbacy, he continued to work intensively. He did all the daily and manual tasks, and most unusual, he asked to serve in the Prosphora bakery. It was unprecedented, an Archimandrite baking Prosphora. He also labored intellectually. Besides studying books and systematically copying out selected quotations, he was occupied with studying Russian. There was, at that time, many Russian monks on Mount Athos. With certain of them he had developed close spiritual ties, and it was necessary for him to know a little of their language. There still remain some handwritten papers which demonstrate his efforts to learn this language thoroughly. For all of these virtues and more, we shall speak about them below. Grigoriou Monastery could take pride in its abbot. 5. Father Athanasios' pastoral skill. When Father Athanasios spoke, whether in admonishment or censure, his words were filled with power. Many times he appeared as a zealous example full of spiritual grace. There was a certain monk of Grigoriou, a tempestuous and inflammable character who was often carried away by anger and would create scenes not in keeping with the monastic surroundings. The elder, who was saddened by his condition, would always remain silent while his disturbance lasted, waiting for the monk to calm down. One day he took the monk and went to the sea. "My child," he said to him, "do you know what happens with the sea? When she is angry and stormy, she capsizes boats, breaks up ships, causes wrecks, and drowns people. And when she recovers her senses and calms down, she is sorry to see what she did. And she hangs her head and says, 'Oh dear, what have I done? Woe is me. To another young and uneducated monk who had difficulty learning the readings for the midnight service, Father Athanasios said, Father Sabas, don't tell me that you can't learn to read. With patience, everything is possible. Do you know how hard the stones are on the mouth of a well? But slowly, the rope pulling on the bucket eats into him. I don't think your brain is as hard as the stones of the well. When he saw that indulgence was called for, he was lenient. When, however, he saw that a sterner approach was necessary, he would appear stern. Thus he gave the following punishment to a monk. Father M., at the next meal, he was to stand upright and say 300 Jesus prayers. Father M. considered this a very heavy punishment. Elder, please don't insist on this, he said. You will make me leave the monastery. My child, here is one path, there another. You can choose whichever one you want, Father Athanasios replied calmly. Seeing the elder's firmness, Father M. conquered himself and did his penance. Father Athanasios' mind possessed discernment and wisdom and the ability to accurately gauge the states of men's souls. This was due to his inner purity, his banishment of all impure passions and darkness from his mind. When a man leads a pure life, his soul becomes refined and light, and far purer than the finest air, as St. John Chrysostom expresses it in his 68th homily on the Gospel according to St. Matthew. He would unerringly discern and weigh the secret actions of his disciples. His eyes could pierce through the innocent appearance to the not-so-innocent truth. Thus, having made an accurate diagnosis, he was able to intervene in the most appropriate manner. The brilliant manner in which he dealt with certain situations leaves one astonished at his pastoral skill. The following story gives a clear impression of wise government. One night, temptation whispered in the ears of Father I, the head ecclesiarch of the monastery, and the words were alluring. Again, you're going to awake at midnight and strike the Simantron? Again, you're going to cut short your sweet sleep? Must you subject yourself to this hardship every night? You're worn out. Let the second ecclesiarch strike the Simantron. Say that you are sick. Give your body a little rest. Just for this once, let yourself sleep out. After a little while came the voice of the other ecclesiarch. Father I, what's happening? Why are you late? The hour has passed. I can't do it, brother. I'm not feeling well. You strike the Simantron. I am sick. At the third circling of the Simantron around the church, the monks went to their stasides and the service began as usual. And Father I, conquered by the demon of negligence, sank like a paralytic into the sea of sleep. Like lead in turbulent water, Exodus 15:10. Just for this night, he reasoned, I'm going to enjoy my rest. Well, the second ecclesiarch informed the abbot of the particulars. He, with his clear mind, understood that it was not a question of illness, but of something else. He was not about to let the problem lie. It was absolutely necessary to intervene and cut off the evil in the beginning, to kill the enemy in its infancy. This is how the Holy Fathers explain the text from Psalm 136, verses 8 to 9. O daughter of Babylon, the wretched one, blessed is he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rock. When they are allowed to grow to manhood, the children of Babylon are difficult to uproot. Father Athanasios was not slow in forming a plan of how to deal with the problem. The so-called sick priest never expected what would happen. Many of the fathers were surprised to see several priests leave the church wearing their vestments. Where could they be going? Where else but to the cell of Father I? We have come to sprinkle your cell with holy water and perform holy unction for your recovery, they told him. Confused by this unexpected visit, Father I had to lie in bed and watch the priest sprinkling holy water, whether he liked it or not. He felt very badly about the whole business. It would have been better had they left him quiet and undisturbed. As the service continued, his conscience began to trouble him. Unhappiness and anxiety filled his soul when he began to fear that holy things were being mocked because of him. This last thought caused him great anguish. The priests finished sprinkling the cell with holy water and were about to begin the service of holy unction. Then, not able to endure any more, he flew up from the bed. "No, no, fathers, don't do an unction service. It's enough. Everything went away. I am well. I will go immediately to the service. There's nothing wrong with me." That was enough. He would never again dare to consent to the temptation of playing sick. At the same time, he could not help but marvel at the elder's pastoral skill. The diagnoses and treatment were perfect, in spite of the fact that the elder was an uneducated man. And there were other cases just like this one. In them all, the wisdom of Father Athanasios predominated. A monk who thought he had a serious illness and was not in his place at ATHOS realized in the end that he enjoyed perfect health. Thus, to relate one more incident, Father Gelasius, expecting that a priest would come to bless him with the holy relics, and that afterward a medical attendant would take him to the hospital for examination, was able to put aside his phenomenal headache and quickly go to his place in church. We find much of this marvelous skill in training souls in the elders of the Holy Mountain. Where did they find their wisdom? The author of the Divine Ladder assures us and answers us, "A soul which has united itself to God through purity shall stand in need of no word of instruction, since this blessed one bears the everlasting word within herself, as her initiator, guide, and illumination." Ladder of Divine Ascent to the Shepherd. O wisdom of the holy elders of monasticism, thou canst dissolve like smoke the guiles of the enemy. All of thy dealings with men are crowned with success. May it be that we find thee in our spiritual quest. Then the faith will blossom forth within us that God has not forsaken his people. 6. The Flying Broom. In the life of St. Sabas the Sanctified, there is an interesting anecdote that shows how he inspired his monks to be thrifty, frugal. In the Lavra's guest house there served a monk named James. This monk once cooked a large amount of fava beans, and he threw the leftovers out of the window into a ditch. The saint saw this from the tower opposite the guest house. Later, without being seen, he went and gathered them up. A few days later, he invited Father James to dinner. When the monk finished eating, he said to him, "Hey, forgive me, brother, that my cooking did not please you." "On the contrary, Holy Father, I was very pleased. I confess that I haven't tasted such delicious and well-cooked food for many years." "Oh, so you liked it. Do you know which beans those were?" "Which ones?" "The ones you threw into the ditch a few days ago." The monk felt badly when he heard these words. Ashamed, he pondered the lesson that the saint had given him. He understood that what belonged to the monastery, whether food or anything else, must be used carefully and economically. Now, we'll go on to Grigoriou Monastery to watch a similar scene. One day, as Father Athanasios was looking out at the sea from his office, he saw an object soaring through the air and falling onto the rocks along the coast. Looking carefully, he saw that it was a broken broom. A few minutes later, the following dialogue between the elder and a monk took place. "Did you throw away that broom?" "Yes, Yerunda." "Why did you throw it away?" "Because it was broken and couldn't be used anymore." "Yes, but there was nothing wrong with the long handle. Why did you throw that away?" "Forgive me, elder, I didn't think of it." "You should have thought. One of the brothers went into the woods and cut it from a tree. He took off the bark, carved it, and shaped it. It took a lot of work, and you, as though all that meant nothing, just destroyed it. We could have put it to good use on another broom." At the time, the monks made their own brooms using special brushwood. "Now you must go down to the cliff and bring it back." The poor monk, he had to go a long way around to find a way down to the rocks. He had to be very careful not to make a false step anywhere. Besides this, he had to endure his own inner resentment. As he confessed later, his thoughts had overwhelmed him. "This is a senseless command the elder gave you," they said to him. "You're just as likely to fall into the sea yourself as to retrieve this worthless broom." In the end, the monk overcame his inner and outer difficulties and returned to the monastery safe and sound, holding that famous broom. From that day on, needless to say, the monk was very careful of his actions, especially about throwing out anything that looked worthless. That frightening climb down the cliff toward the waves thundering on the rocks was a most effective lesson on carefulness and thrift. That episode was a sober lesson to the other fathers of the monastery also. The flying broom and the adventures of the monk who had thrown it taught everyone to be very careful in handling the belongings of the monastery. They continually kept in mind the words of the Holy Gospel, that nothing be lost, John 6:12, even if it appears small and insignificant. 7. The protection of the saints. The burden of Father Athanasios' abbacy was shared by the saints who protect Grigoriou Monastery. Of these saints, St. Nicholas comes first. About 8 years after Father Athanasios became abbot, a wonderful event gave great spiritual joy to the fathers and revived their devotion to the Bishop of Myra. How can one not break forth in praise when one sees the tangible assistance of a saint? There were two brothers, Father Michael and Father Chrysanthus, who worked in the monastery's bakery. One day, just as on many others, they were preparing the wheat that was to be ground in the mill. They passed it through a special machine to clean it of dirt and chaff. They were not very happy, however, because the wheat was almost used up and it was difficult to procure more. Suddenly, a little old man came up to their work area. He was short, bald, and poorly dressed, and he held a gospel in his hand. "How are you, fathers? How is it going?" "Well, glory be to God." "Do you have all the wheat you need?" "What you see is all we have, grandfather. It is only enough for one baking, and we have to do 2 bakings a week." "Don't worry, fathers. God is great." Shortly afterward, he blessed the wheat and left. A little while later, the 2 monks said, "We didn't do right to let that old man leave. Let's call him back and give him something to eat." They ran after him to catch him, but he was nowhere to be found. A strange thing. One would think he were a young man with wings on his feet to disappear so fast. They asked around to the other monks, but no one had seen him or knew anything about him. Little by little, they came to realize that the little old man might have been St. Nicholas. There was some doubt, of course, but time took care of that, for they beheld a wonder. The wheat that the old man had blessed lasted for 6 whole months. It was an obvious miracle. Their faith in St. Nicholas's vigilant care for the monastery was greatly strengthened, as was the fathers' moral firmness and their devotion to their patron saint. At that time, the older monks used to tell about miracles that had happened in the past. The younger ones never grew tired of listening to them. It would not be superfluous for us also to listen to some of their stories. Father Simeon, the elder of Father Athanasios, had absolute faith in St. Nicholas's protection. He believed that the saint looked after the needs of the monastery more than anyone else. Once, as the 6th of December was approaching, all the fathers were gathered in a meeting. With the help of God, all the preparations for the feast were going well. Only the cooks were worried because they did not have enough fish to feed all the monks. On the day before the feast in the afternoon, they went to the abbot. "Elder," they said, "don't you think we ought to plan for salt cod? If so, we will put in water to soak." No, don't think of that. We'll have fresh fish. St. Nicholas will take care of it." Meanwhile, the all-night vigil began. Compline, Great Vespers, Litia, Orthos, the 6 Psalms, Kathismata, and so on, one thing after the other. Again, the anxious cooks went to the abbot. "Elder, now it's even too late to cook salt cod. Should we start cooking some beans?" No, the fish will come." This was something that the cooks couldn't understand. How was the fish going to come? And when? Orthos was half over. What made the abbot so sure? The choir began singing the lauds, and the cooks were getting even more upset. Then suddenly, joyful voices were heard from the courtyard. The dock master, gasping and excited, was shouting, "Fathers, come down here, get baskets and come down. The saint has made a great miracle." What had happened? A large wave had come, strewn the beach with large and succulent bass. It was a gift from God, an obvious miracle of the saint. Everyone was amazed, especially the cooks. They didn't know what to marvel at first, the miracle of the saint or the unshakable faith of the abbot. At no other feast had they ever had such fresh and tasty fish. The saint had given them a bountiful blessing, both spiritual and material. Another miraculous event occurred on a feast day of St. Nicholas during the abbacy of Father Simeon. This time, the cellarer informed the abbot that he would not be able to give any oil to the hermits. At that time they were accustomed to give a certain amount of oil as a blessing to the poor ascetics who took part in the feasts. "What is the difficulty?" asked the abbot. "We don't have much oil. There's only half a jar left." "It doesn't matter. Give them what is left." The cellarer obeyed. Portioning out the oil to the ascetics, he made them happy, but he himself did not feel any great joy. They had a little oil left. Now it would be completely gone. These were the thoughts dictated by his logic, and even more by his lack of faith. That which followed, however, and which he was the first to ascertain, brought new life to his faith in the providence and power of God. Their kind and compassionate protector, St. Nicholas, again intervened. The level of the oil in the jar did not go down at all, not even by 1 centimeter. It remained where it was before. Thus the hermits received their alms, the monastery suffered no loss, and the monk who was lacking in faith received a valuable lesson. If someone had the patience to search through the various books and records of the holy monastery, he would find countless miracles of St. Nicholas. Many times he protected the monastery from sure destruction by fire and saved monks who had fallen down steep cliffs. Many times also he saved boats and ships from certain shipwreck. In the catholicon of the monastery, from the great ring around the brass chandelier, there hangs a silver model of a schooner. What does it represent? It represents a certain schooner that had come to pick up a load of lumber at the monastery. The sea was so heavy that it was in danger of foundering. As soon as the sailors called on St. Nicholas, however, the tempest was stilled, and beyond hope, they were saved from certain death. Another protector of the monastery is the Holy Virgin Martyr Anastasia the Roman, who in the 3rd century was martyred by Decius with terrible tortures. Toward the west end of the outer courtyard there is a compunctionate church dedicated to her name. Many fragments of her holy relics have been preserved in the monastery, including portions of her skin, which have become fragrant with time. There is a special receptacle containing blood shed at the time of her martyrdom. St. Anastasia especially cares for the health of the fathers, and for this reason they gave her the name physician. It is no easy task to enumerate all the times when the monks were delivered from sickness by her miraculous power. There were periods of time when the infirmians of the monastery had nothing at all to do, because anyone who fell sick had only to make a prostration before the relics of St. Anastasia, and he would be immediately healed. Some time ago, we were visiting Grigoriou monastery, and we walked up to the gardens. Below some large water reservoirs in the dwelling of the gardener, we met there the aged monk Father Hesychast and his young assistant, a novice. Father Hesychast, who was cheerful, simple, and talkative, was very willing to talk to us about Father Athanasios, the monastery, and their patron saints. From the time I was a child, he told us, among other things, I suffered from hemorrhages from my nose. They plagued me for years. In 1935, I was then 38 years old. I had the obedience of cook. One day I had a severe nosebleed. I had heard the other monks talking continually about St. Anastasia's cures, and I ran to the priest on duty and asked him to take out her holy relics. He put on an epitrachelion, took out the right hand of the saint, and with it made the sign of the cross over my nose. That was all there was to it. 40 whole years have passed since then, and I've never even once been bothered by nosebleeds. The healing that the saint gave me was a perfect gift. Patron saints. The more one thinks about this reality, the more one marvels. the good God has assigned to the various institutions of the Church small gods, if you will, if that expression is permissible. How happy he must feel who is overshadowed by their strong wings. One must keep vigil and pray to maintain the best possible relationship with them. 8. The vision of a monk. The following account emphasizes what we've been relating up to now about Grigoriou's patron saints. It also exemplifies what great favor and goodwill God shows to simple and humble souls. Father Athanasios was exceedingly happy with the conduct of his disciple, Father G, not only because he so willingly executed all his monastic duties, but also because he had a very simple and honest heart. Whenever they conversed together, he revealed everything in a simple and guileless way. His soul was like a straight road that knew nothing of twists, turns, or forks. He discerned in him, to use a patristic phrase, an unadulterated nature and unvaried simplicity. Heaven easily bends down toward such souls, and the veils between this world and the other are easily parted asunder. ATHOS was in process. The service had reached the 9th canticle of the canon, the canticle that relates to the person of the Theotokos, when the monk, looking toward the beautiful gate, saw an unexpected sight. 2 women, stately and dignified, were coming out through the gate, one behind the other. This was something entirely new and unprecedented. How did women come in here? He asked himself. They continued into the church and walked past the monks, among whom the second woman, at the command of the first, distributed money. After the liturgy and morning trapeza, Father G rushed to see his elder. "Elder," he said, "who were those women who came into the church today?" Father Athanasios immediately understood that some heavenly blessing had been granted to his disciple. "How did you see them? How many were there? What did they look like?" "There were 2 of them," Father G replied. "The first was a little taller than the second. She wore a beautiful red garment that also covered her head, and she looked like a queen. The second one was younger, very modest, small in body, and wore dark gray clothing. The second one was giving out coins to the fathers, as directed by the First Lady." God has sent you a beautiful vision, my child. The First Lady that you saw was the all-holy Theotokos, the Queen and Sovereign Lady of the Holy Mountain, and the second was Saint Anastasia, the protectress of our monastery, whose holy relics we have. This is how it seems to me, Elder. That is what my soul feels, but I cannot understand why they were distributing coins. What do the saints have to do with money? They wanted to show that they are pleased with the labors of the fathers who get up at night to sing hymns to God and the saints, and that they deserve a reward. Remember what we read in the Synaxarion for October 1st? I can't remember. What do we read? We read the life of St. John of Kukuzelis, who was the greatest musician and the best chanter of his time. He was the head musician of the choir at the king's palace. From his great love of God, he abandoned Constantinople and its palaces and settled here on Mount Athos at the monastery of the Lavra. One time it was the Saturday of the Akathist. While he was chanting with great attention in the monastery Kathilikon, from weariness, he fell into a little sleep standing in his stasidi. Then appeared the Lady Theotokos and said to him, "Rejoice, John, my son, sing to me, and I will not forsake you." And she put something in his hand. He immediately awoke, full of great emotion. He was surprised to see that he actually was holding a gold coin in his right hand. Later, when he placed the coin in the church, miracles were performed. Father G, listening ecstatically to the words of the elder, he understood the hidden meaning of the giving of the coins. He was strengthened in his faith that the saints are alive and lovingly attend to the labors of the monks. From that day on, he kissed the icons of the Mother of God and Saint Anastasia with greater reverence, as well as the holy relics of the latter. Some time later, Father G became afflicted with horrible disease, also known as St. Anthony's fire. His face and eyes became red and inflamed, and he was tormented with headaches and fever. He sought no medicine but the relics of St. Anastasia, and he was cured immediately. We should not at all be amazed at any of this. In the life of a monk, especially a holy mountain monk, the supernatural element is very near. The monks are used to the unusual. It is enough that such things happen. As St. Paul states, "The eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that ye may know what is the hope of his calling, and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints." Ephesians 1:18. 9. Abbot Athanasios' resignation. During the period of his abbacy, Father Athanasios was confronted many times with various problems and difficulties. In his first years, he was worn out by the calendar question. He had no desire to align the monastery with something that was being imposed on them by the modernist spirit. His stand was reminiscent of the Studite monks. "We must," he said, "remain unshaken pillars of the ancient traditions of our fathers and appear as brave soldiers of Christ, and not say, 'The bishops and the patriarchs tell us.' What does the Apostle Paul, the mouth of Christ, tell us? 'Even if angels descend from heaven and preach another gospel, do not listen to them.' Galatians 1:8. In 1927, Father Athanasios even refused to receive a representative of the state as an official visitor to the monastery. In consequence of this action, he was dismissed from his abbacy by the Holy Community, and was even threatened with exile. This did not hold for long, however, and after a few days he was reinstated to his position. When Father Athanasios had served as abbot for 13 years, he felt in himself a strong need to be freed from the heavy responsibilities of the office. During his abbacy, he had carefully observed the principles established for the monastery by former abbots. He believed that the more closely we imitate the fathers in their way of life, the more we will be able to attain their successful end. One deviation from tradition, especially without serious reason, can lead to a second. The second easily accepts a third, and the evil continues. In 1937, the 13th year of his abbacy, he found himself in the unpleasant position of confronting the violation of a traditional principle dealing with the inner life of the monastery. The matter appeared to him very serious, and in protest he resigned his abbacy. The monk who was the cause of the violation of the canon immediately recognized his fault. He ran to find the abbot, fell at his feet, and asked forgiveness. "Forgive me, elder. May God forgive you, father." "Elder, do not insist on resigning. Recall it. You must resume your abbacy." "My child, is that how much God wants me to be abbot?" With his resignation, the monastery found itself in a difficult position, both personally and through the intercession of important personages of the Holy Mountain. The fathers tried to persuade him to change his mind. But Father Athanasios, even though he was re-elected abbot of the monastery, would not give in. "I love silence very much," he said to them. "I asked God to grant it to me, and God gave me this opportunity. From now on, I want to live as a simple monk. There are so many other worthy and capable fathers who can assume the abbacy and exercise it better than I." Seeing his resolve, they gave way. Father Athanasios was not taken with high positions. He viewed honors and ranks only through the prism of duty and obedience to the will of God. They therefore left him to look to himself a little, as he was wont to say, and to prepare himself for the journey to heaven. Elder Athanasios of Grigoriou Monastery continued, Part 4, Spiritual Radiance. 1. His spiritual greatness. Father Athanasios had a most venerable appearance, which reminded one of the ancient fathers of the desert, the Thebaid. Looking at him, one realized he was not of this world. All the virtues of the monastic saints, they seemed concentrated in his face, which had a certain distinct tone upon it. All who saw him were immediately impressed by the expression of his face. Peacefulness and quiet were permanently inscribed on it. Even when assaulted by heavy waves, he never lost his serenity. When it happened that anyone grieved, accused, or insulted him, he would not say anything at all, neither to complain nor to defend himself. There were occasions at the gatherings of the elders when certain eccentric elders grieved him very much by their behavior. However, he would stifle his inner reactions, remaining calm and not showing the least irritation. When the meeting was finished, he would go to the church and immerse himself in psalmody, thus refreshing his tired soul. He placed patience and peacefulness above all else. Trying to convey the gift of silence to his disciples, he would often say, "By silence one is saved from great harm." He had the gift and ability to deliver souls from the demon of sorrow, that terrible demon that sinks men into the darkness of despair. Like a moth eats clothes and a worm wooden furniture, say the Holy Fathers, so sorrow consumes the soul of man. One time, a hero monk from Neuskete was greatly tormented by a temptation, and had reached the point where he dared not to even liturgize anymore. The last time he had served, he had hardly been able to finish the divine liturgy. Going now to Grigoriou monastery to see his confessor, he thought he would be given a heavy penance. Father Athanasios, however, recognized the suffocating stranglehold of the spirit of sorrow, and he broke it immediately. "Bravo," he said. "That is how humble I want the priests who confess to me to be, humble and with a feeling of their worthlessness. I congratulate you. The penance I am giving you is to begin to serve the divine liturgy tomorrow." Countless souls found comfort and peace under his epitrachelion. He always used the same epitrachelion when hearing confessions that he had worn when he was ordained. According to Orthodox theology, even created objects participate in uncreated divine grace. Thus it happened that this particular epitrachelion also became grace-bearing. Today it is preserved in the cell of a Grigoriou monk who especially reveres Father Athanasios and who even bears his name. At times it emits a sweet fragrance. Several times it was placed on the head of a certain monk who suffered from sorrow and anxiety, and he immediately received peace. Father Athanasios and everything around him was a focal point of joy and peace. Father Athanasios was very circumspect with his words. He never opened his mouth to judge a brother. When a certain one of his disciples, either in confession or conversation, happened to refer to the faults of others, he cut him short. "Leave the others alone and concentrate on yourself," he said to them. "Be far from judging. Judging is a fire that burns." He possessed great self-control. In moments of crisis, he showed himself to be the master of the situation. After his term as abbot, when he perceived that his successor needed assistance, he would take his staff, go to the abbot's quarters, and manage to inspire him with courage. In his relations with others, he showed great kindness and gentleness. He respected every man. Even the youngest monks of the monastery he never addressed by name only, but called them father or elder. Once he needed a candle holder, said an old ecclesiarch, and he wouldn't take it by himself, but he humbly asked me for it. "But, elder," I said, "why are you asking me? You are the abbot. You can take it for yourself." "No, my child," he replied, "don't think that way. In your obedience, you are the abbot." He could not tolerate to have others wait on him. During his abbacy, there was a special monk who, according to the canons of the monastery, was appointed to serve the abbot and look after his quarters. Father Athanasios was careful not to tire out this monk, and would take care of his own quarters and his various needs. Simplicity and humility were his precious adornments. In fact, as the years passed, he became even more simple. His soul softened, and he became almost childlike. That element of childlike innocence and simplicity which the Lord praises in the Gospels, it is a distinctive sign of a saint. His humility of mind was apparent in everything. As abbot, he had to move his belongings to the abbot's quarters, but he himself did not want to be separated from his humble cell, and in spite of the father's pressure, he chose to remain in it. Whenever he happened to converse with someone, he used to bend his head slightly and look downward, while his voice was imbued with humility. How can one sufficiently praise his temperance? The evil mistress, as the Holy Fathers call the stomach, was not at all happy with him. Of the food he was served in the refectory, he only ate a small part, about a quarter of it. Neither did he drink wine, except a little as a blessing, and then always mixed with water. In the area of abstinence, he was marvelous and unsurpassable. He lived according to the saying of St. Basil, "He who passes by the flesh, despising it, cares for the soul which is truly immortal." It should be noted that he loved this saying very much and often had it on his lips. In the virtue of poverty also he wished to be consistent. Poverty and privation is an indispensable part of the life of a true monk. We will relate 2 incidents to demonstrate Father Athanasios' virtue in this regard. Once, when he was quite old, his successor as abbot visited him in his cell. It happened that he was making coffee. Father Bassario noticed something and said, "Elder, why don't you use sugar in your coffee?" "I don't have sugar. I use a spoonful of honey, which happens to be here," he answered. The abbot was surprised by this voluntary deprivation, since the monastery had the means to supply the fathers with both coffee and sugar. He was touched, and he took care to bring him some sugar. The elder accepted it, thanked him, and made the following comment: "Up till now I have denied myself nothing, and what will I say to God about the poverty obligatory for a monk?" Second incident has to do with the contents of his wallet. When it was opened after his death, they found some peculiar pieces of paper. They bore the words 100 drachmas, 500 drachmas, 1,000 drachmas. On the other sides of the paper were written sayings of St. John Callinicus, St. Ephraim, Abba Isaac the Syrian, and other fathers. They were spiritual banknotes. They were his money. Truly how much grace and greatness is hidden in this incident. 2. A grace-filled incident. Once a brother of Grigoriou monastery, Elder Barlaam, was confronted by a difficult economic situation. As the representative of the monastery, he had to go to one of its matokia to be present at an appraisal of the property which was to be made by a government official. At that time, the government was expropriating monastery properties. Elder Barlaam expected that the price the monastery was suggesting would not be accepted, and therefore he thought to enlist the help of Father Athanasios, the wise Elder Barlaam, who left a mark on the contemporary era of the Holy Mountain by his successful handling of difficult matters, both for his monastery and for the holy community, believed that the presence of Father Athanasios would prove effective. Before leaving for the Matokian, after much pleading, he succeeded in persuading Father Athanasios to go with him. At the Matokian, Father Barlaam met the government official, and in the office they began the negotiations. As he had foreseen, the official was unyielding. Not only did he not agree with the monastery's proposal, but he offered a price which was quite different, and very unfair to the monastery. He left no margin for hope that it might be increased. Father Barlaam's efforts achieved nothing. Distressed, he left the office and went to tell Father Athanasios what had happened. He, however, was calm, undisturbed, and he soothed Father Barlaam. "I'll go and tell him what our economic situation is at the monastery, Father Barlaam. Maybe God will help, and we will come to terms." Father Athanasios went to the office, knocked on the door, and presented himself to the government representative. With his kind face and calm voice, he greeted him and introduced himself. "I came by myself to plead with you about the price of the Matokian. Please help us in this matter because our monastery is poor." That was all he said. As soon as he saw him, the government official, he was impressed. The man had seen many clerics and monks in his lifetime, but he had never met anyone like this holy mountain, Yeronda. Before him was one who looked like a biblical patriarch. Without understanding why, he stood there immobile, just staring at him. And the result was that he became another man. Something in his soul changed. "For your reverend person, Yeronda, I am willing to raise the price," he told him, and with great goodwill and respect. The official, who before would not budge 1 inch from his position after the intervention of Father Athanasios, raised the price considerably. It was even higher than what the monastery had originally asked. Father Athanasios had triumphed. Father Barlaam, who was awaiting the outcome with great anxiety, he ran up to Father Athanasios as soon as he saw him leaving the office. When he was told about the unhoped-for change in the government representative, he didn't know what to believe. He didn't know how to express his joy to Father Athanasios about the successful outcome. To himself, he thought, I must have known something when I insisted that the elder come with me. Indeed, the inner brightness of Father Athanasios was also mirrored in his exterior. Father Daniel, a monk from the skeet of Dionysiou monastery, told us the following incident. When I was a young monk, I visited Grigoriou monastery with my elder. It began to rain, and we stayed for 2 days. I was impressed by the figure of the abbot. It was a joy to look at him. He was so quiet, so peaceful, so sweet, so gentle. It made me very happy just to gaze at him. Just his appearance alone told you he was a holy man. Hero monk Pantaleimon of Simonopetra emphasized to us, Blessed Father Athanasios was a radiant man. He was so sweet, he made you yield your soul into his hands. At the same time, he was so venerable and dignified that you felt a breath of fear in his presence. 3. During Divine Liturgy. Father Athanasios revealed the full richness of his faith and piety when he celebrated the church services. For him there was no greater joy on earth than to conduct the Divine Liturgy. His heart leaped, soared, became like a burning seraphim each time he was made worthy to serve at the holy altar. He always sought opportunities to celebrate liturgy. During the period when he was abbot, his rule was to liturgize by himself twice a week on Thursdays and Saturdays. On Sundays and the great feasts, many priests concelebrated. He ardently yearned to be near the holy altar. It is difficult to imagine the heavenly moments he experienced every time he performed the bloodless sacrifice. He was ruled at the same time by holy fear and an inexpressible divine exaltation. He was deeply shaken by the fearful presence of the Lamb who was consumed, and before that terrible mystery of divine love and humility, he would shed his heart's tears. After his abbacy ended, during concelebrations, he would stand to the left of the holy table. After the great entrance, he would lower his head and keep his gaze immovably cast downward, while his eyes became fountains which flooded his face with scalding tears. A holy trembling of soul would overcome the other priests also, to the point where it was difficult to continue the liturgy. Father Athanasios, as the celebrants near to him observed, would hardly have time to wipe his face before it was again deluged by the springs of water. Who knows what revelations were given him by the Lamb of God? Who knows what his eyes beheld upon the altar? Elder Bessarion, the successor of the abbot, asked him with persistence many times, Yarando, what is it that so shakes your soul? Is it possible that God gives you any revelations, theorias? Father Athanasios would always avoid answering. He promised him once that he would tell him later, but he left this life without revealing anything. Our life, St. Paul wrote, is hidden with Christ in God. Colossians 3:3. 4. The activities of the Spirit. If the Holy Eucharist is communion with Christ, the mystery of chrismation is communion with the Holy Spirit. Every Orthodox Christian who is anointed receives upon himself the sacred seal of the Paraclete. From that moment, the Holy Spirit is established within him like a heavenly seed. If it finds good earth and mild air, it germinates, grows, and develops into a great tree, Luke 13:19, which paradisically leaves and flowers and fruits grow. Then takes place within the faithful unspeakable things that the mind of man has never imagined, which has never entered into the heart of man, 1 Corinthians 2:9. In Orthodoxy's collection of ascetical writings, the Philokalia, the love of the beautiful, the good, there are extensive passages dealing with these heavenly states. They describe in detail all the stages of the growth of the spiritual seed. Unusual ascetical expressions are encountered there. such as activity of the heart, and dew of the spirit, and noetic sense, and fire of the heart, and divine intoxication, and leaping of the heart, and the ravishing of the nous, and so on. Well, the monk who truly and genuinely follows his course will, without fail, encounter the activities of the spirit. As he advances with sweat and toil along the narrow road of ascetic life, the blessed hour will arrive when he will feel within himself the palpable presence of the Holy Spirit. From that moment, his heart becomes a place of verdure, as the psalmist expresses it in Psalm 22:2. From that hour the holy words of the Lord take on their full divine meaning. He that believeth on me, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. John 7:38. And those waters will sometimes change to a flaming fire, which warms the soul and body, and which makes the heart burn, as did the hearts of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Then man, in amazement, cries out, like St. Simeon the new theologian, "How dost thou exist as blazing fire? How also as bedewing water?" If a monk is found to be a worthy vessel of grace, the Paraclete is given to him even more powerfully. Whatever was darkest becomes manifest as light, according to the phrase of St. Grigoriou the theologian in defense of his flight to Pontus. And the unutterable activity of the heart is transformed into unutterable light, and even to light which emits sweet fragrance, sweet-smelling light. The fragrance of a spiritual man is felt by other virtuous and spiritual souls. Let all this not be thought unrelated to our subject. The hero monk whose life we're writing rose to all these holy degrees, proceeding from strength to strength. Several years ago we visited an old monk on Mount Athos, a laborer of the inner life, and between us passed the following dialogue. "What else do you have to say yet about the ever-memorable Father Athanasios?" He was a faster, a strict ascetic. One could have met such a struggler even in the desert. The Holy Spirit abode in him. When you went to him, he talked to you, and a sweet smell came out from him. His mouth gave off fragrance. What kind of fragrance was it? Like that of the relics of the saints? Did everyone feel it? No, only he who led a virtuous and clean life. A spiritual man understands a spiritual man. A prophet can discern another prophet. Others notice nothing. This information made a deep impression on us. Without a doubt, Father Athanasios had reached the most exalted spiritual degrees. There are numerous incidences that indicate that the activities of the Holy Spirit were manifest in him as a mental light of knowledge, noetic, that is, and revelation, something similar to what happened with the prophets. The following account of an aged Grigoriou monk, Father Sophronios, illustrates this to us well. In the beginning of my monastic life, I was carried away by ascetic enthusiasm, and I undertook many kinds of exercises, like in a gymnasium. Once I wore iron chains under my clothes, and to make it even more difficult to sleep, I put pebbles under my bed covers. I thought that in this way I would please God and follow in the footsteps of the ancient ascetics. I said nothing to anybody about all this. No one knew of my progress, not even the elder. One day he paid a visit to my cell. "Well, how are you doing here, Father Sophronios? How are things going?" "By your prayers, elder, I'm well." "Could you be doing more ascetic exercises than called for? Your body has become weak and easily tired." "I don't belong among the diligent monks, elder." "Let us see, though, my child, what you have put under your covers." "What do I see here? Pebbles." "Take them and throw them away." I was astounded, continued Father Sophronios. I thought it was humanly impossible for the elder to know about the pebbles. Could he also know about the chains, I thought to myself. The thought had hardly entered my head when he said, "Father Sophronios, let me see what you're wearing on your body. What are these things? Take off these chains. They won't do you any good." At that moment, the young Grigoriou monk experienced a holy tremor. He realized that there was something wonderful about his own Geronda, something supernatural, not of this world. The Paraclete abode within him and revealed to him unknown and secret things. Father Sophronios had loved and respected his elder before, but now his devotion increased exceedingly. The grace of the Holy Spirit manifestly lived, moved, and acted in Father Athanasios. When many years later Father Athanasios was preparing for his journey to heaven, Father Sophronios received a similar ray of light from the God-bearing mind of the elder. He visited the monastery infirmary where the elder was living and being cared for by the infirmarian, Father Artemius. Next to his bed, he saw various personal articles. Among them he noticed an alarm clock, which played a melodious tune when it rang. The elder was going to distribute these belongings to the brothers of the monastery as blessings. Father Sophronios let his desire be captivated by that alarm clock, and he thought to himself, "Man, how good it would be if he gave that to me." Before he could finish his thought, however, Father Athanasios turned toward him and said very naturally, "Don't have such a thing in your mind. I promised the alarm clock to Father Artemios." (5) Clairvoyance. Father Sophrony was not the only person who had a personal experience of Father Athanasios' clairvoyance. The following narratives further emphasize the spiritual strength of this holy man. The zeal of the fiery Old Testament prophet Elias. "I have been very zealous for the Lord of hosts," 1 Kings 19:14, is often seen in the monks of the Holy Mountain. At critical times in the past, when the faith and tradition of orthodoxy had been seriously threatened, ATHOS has raised up fighters, confessors, martyrs. We must confess, however, that there have been instances when the zeal of certain holy mountain monks, probably combined with ignorance, fanaticism, and a lack of discernment, had caused serious harm both to individuals and communities. The Scripture commands, "Turn not to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest," Joshua 1:7. Father E., a monk of Grigoriou, carried away by this unreasoning zeal, decided to leave his monastery. His reasons had to do with the calendar question, combined with the visit and liturgy at the monastery by a certain bishop. At night, therefore, without anyone knowing, he gathered his belongings, he lowered himself from a window by a rope, and landed outside the enclosure. He then realized that he had left something important in his cell, his prayer book, a book he needed very much. So he hid in the bushes above the forecourt of the monastery and waited for the gate to open at dawn. He had to get that book in any way possible. The gate opened at the appointed time, and some of the fathers went out to go to work. Well, Father E. saw them all, but nobody could see him in his hiding. A moment later, the abbot also came out. Slowly and steadily he advanced toward the forecourt. He reached the spot directly below where Father E. was hidden, stopped, turned in his direction with a slightly raised voice, addressed the hidden monk. "Father E., come down, quickly, come down." Father E. was speechless, confused, stunned, and ashamed. Making no opposition at all, he came down. He understood that something supernatural had just taken place with his elder, and he returned to his cell in repentance. Father Athanasios' clairvoyance would manifest itself at the proper times. God knows at what time, for which persons, and in which circumstances to intervene and send the activity of His grace to His Spirit-bearing servants. In every case there is a concrete objective, which can be, among others, the moral encouragement of a struggle, the strengthening of his faith, the inflaming of his divine longing, and this is evident in the two following incidents. A young student of medicine named Panagiotis Mihas, later Archimandrite and Abbot Bessarion, forsook his relatives, forsook his studies and the world, and impelled the ship of his soul to the harbor of ATHOS. More particularly, he impelled it to the monastery of Grigoriou. Soon he was walking up the cobbled pathway and approaching the door of the monastery. In front of him appeared a venerable, dignified monk who fixed his gaze upon the young man. He naturally did not know this was Abbot Athanasios. He had never met him before, nor exchanged any words with him. As the young man came nearer, Father Athanasios, as if he had known him for years, he greeted him heartily. "Welcome, Panayotis. Welcome to our monastery, my child. I have been waiting for you for a long time. It is good that you have come." The young Panayotis had never met a prophet before in his life, and he was deeply moved by this event. His whole being was shaken by holy emotion. Whatever exalted visions he had had about monasticism, he saw them alive before him. Any faint-heartedness about leaving the world that the enemy might have inspired in him was replaced by peace and spiritual exaltation. With a supernatural sign, God assured Panayotis of the rightness of his decision. He was glad that he had exchanged the corrupt life of the world for the incorruptible and enlightened life of a monk. A certain elder from Karasia, the region of the desert below the peak of Athos and above Kapsokalivia, referred to sometimes as the dreaded Kurulia and Karasia, sent his disciple, Father Simeon, to Grigoriou monastery for a certain number of prosphora that they needed for the liturgy. The elder knew of no other reason for sending him there. God, however, was planning to give the elder's disciple a blessed surprise, to open to him a window from the world of divine grace, to teach him that the sacrifices of the monastic life are rewarded with heavenly gifts. Ascending from the harbor to the monastery, Father Simeon thought of what he had to do. First, he had to find the abbot and tell him why he'd been sent. Then, with the abbot's blessing, he had to find the monk who baked the prosphora, who would give him the proper amount. That is how he thought it would happen, but it did not turn out that way. In front of the monastery gate, the monk from Karasia saw the abbot. He was holding something in his hands. Stopped him, he said, "Take these, my child. These are the prosphora the elder sent you for." Father Simeon was struck speechless. He was touching the impalpable. He realized that Athos still nourished holy men filled with divine light. While he was returning to his elder, the entire world of his soul underwent an unprecedented mystical change. This incident was a golden page in the book of his life. Every now and then he would relate to it with obvious joy and enthusiasm. On the morning of May 8, 1930, before the Divine Liturgy, the abbot of Grigoriou was conversing with the newly arrived 28-year-old man, a sailor from Piraeus. Some strong spiritual desire had brought him to the holy mountain. He recounted all of his life to the elder, and he asked to be accepted as a monk. 45 years went by. The sailor from Piraeus became a monk of Grigoriou. Later, to put his talents to better use, they transferred him to a neighboring monastery. Today, he is 73 years of age, and he is completely unable to erase from his mind the holy image of Father Athanasios. He even remembers in detail their first conversations together. All that the elder had told him then about his character, his mentality, and the difficulties he would meet in the monastic life, and his future development, came to pass. All his words were accurate. He remembers one observation in particular. Father Athanasios had said, "You fishermen, you sailors, are used to a free life, and you're going to have some difficulties adapting to the confined life of a monastery." 6. A merciful heart. A merciful heart, writes the wise Abbot Isaac the Syrian, is one that burns with love for all creation, for all men, for all the birds and the animals, for the demons, for every created being, and by the recollection and sight of them, the eyes of a merciful man pour forth abundant tears, from the strong and vehement mercy which grips his heart, and from his great compassion. His heart is humbled, and he cannot bear to hear or to see any injury or slight sorrow in any creation. Homily 81, Abbot Isaac Syrian. A heart burning for all creation? This is a great saying. Who can achieve it? Who is able to reach such a height of charity that he even feels compassion for the demons. To Father Athanasios, however, these high summits, so difficult to access, were not unknown. The lungs of his soul breathed deeply of the divine air of Eden. His sensitive nature was filled with a rare love for all creatures. There are many incidences in his life that show this clearly, and which bring to mind similar events in the lives of the great monastic saints. They especially remind us of the renowned hermit of Helicon, St. Luke, 10th century, who fed birds, took care of snakes, shielded deer from hunters, tamed wild beasts, made friends with poisonous reptiles, and embraced all creation with love. In the southeastern part of Grigoriou Monastery, a roe deer was running like a tornado down toward the rocky shore, terrified for its life. Some kosmikos and laymen who worked in the monastery had discovered it high up in the mountain and were madly pursuing it, equipped with weapons and dogs. They had encircled it so that it had no way to go but down. And the poor animal dashed down to the seaside, leaped into the water, and began to swim away from shore. The hunters, however, lost no time, but quickly ran to the dock, loosed a rowboat, and began rowing out toward the deer. They caught it, even though it had managed to swim 2 kilometers out to sea. They couldn't wait to get it back to shore and slaughter it, roast it, and enjoy its savory meat. Father Athanasios was soon informed of what had happened. Immediately, he set aside all his work as if something serious had happened and rushed down to the dock. Why all this haste and extraordinary concern? For no other reason but to be in time to spare the captured animal's life and restore it to freedom. This is what is meant by a heart burning for all creation. Well, let us leave the roe deer, a gentle and prized animal, and go on to foxes. Was he equally concerned for them? Across from the holy monastery on the side towards Simonopetra are the vineyards of Grigoriou. There one would always find Father Ioannikios. He had the obedience of vine-dresser. He took great care to fulfill his duties well. Among other things, he had to guard the vineyard from enemies that hid in the surrounding shrub. Even the scriptures mention these enemies. Catch the little foxes that spoil the vine. Song of Solomon 2:15. The monk was capable and energetic, and he took strong, effective measures against his crafty foe, the foxes. He set special iron traps and caught them, and then killed and skinned them. And he did all of this with a quiet conscience, confident that he was fulfilling his duty in everything, his diakonima. The elder knew nothing of his disciples' exploits. As soon as he was informed, his soul reacted strongly against it. He could not accept even the thought of such harsh measures. What a terrible thing to slaughter an animal caught in a trap, to kill it and skin it. How horrible! And the one doing this was a monk, wearing the angelic schema? This could not continue. He could in no way endure such disharmony. Therefore he summoned the vine-dresser in order to give him some suitable advice. "My child," he said, "you must think of other ways to deal with the foxes. Hang tin cans around and bang them for whatever else you want. Don't use any more traps. Monks are not allowed to use such cruel and torturous methods. Now let us leave the foxes and go on to another type of animal. Here we shall discover something paradoxical in the reasoning of the saints. Common reasoning demands that a wild and dangerous animal be exterminated. The saints, however, they think differently." Now and then Father Athanasios would pay a visit to Voltista, a Metochian of Grigoriou. It is in a beautiful location. It sits on a high promontory, and the eye can see as far as the plain of Thessaly and the sparkling waters of the Axios and Alikomnos rivers. Elder, the workers of the Metochian, told him at one of his visits, "We have a surprise for you. We're going to show you a rare sight." "Oh, what surprise is that?" "Well, we found 2 little wolf cubs in the forest. We thought we wouldn't kill them immediately so we could show them to your holiness." In a little while the elder was looking at the 2 wild animals. Indeed, he'd never seen anything like them before. He carefully examined the beautiful design of their bodies, their long legs, their necks, muzzles, their alert ears. They were frightened at being in such strange surroundings. He felt great sympathy and affection for the wolves. He felt sorry for them and began to fondle them. He thought of how their mother was suffering. Finally, he told the workmen something they did not expect. "Listen, don't hurt them or kill them. Let them return to their den. Their mother is sad, is looking for them now." The affection Father Athanasios showed to wild animals was reciprocated. They were meek and gentle with him, and even obeyed him, as we shall see in the following narrative. In the monastery cemetery, which Father Athanasios often visited, there prowled a large snake. It wasn't long before a friendship developed between them. Neither of them was disturbed by the presence of the other. This did not hold true, however, for the other monks, such as Hierodeacon Pachomius, who had to go to the cemetery now and then to light the lampadas. He happened also to be fearful by nature, and whenever he saw the snake, he would not only frightened, but would even give way to disorderly flight. He was truly to be pitied. When he told the elder of his sad state, Father Athanasios soothed him and calmed him down, assuring him that the unwanted reptile would soon go away permanently from the cemetery. And truly, it happened as he said. Father Pachomius never saw the snake again, to his great joy. Only one doubt, one unanswered question remained in him. By what means did the elder expel the snake? Did he command it to leave? Did he read some service? Did he pray? No one knew. It was enough that it had disappeared, although no one knew how or why. The close intimate bond between the saints and creatures, even wild beasts and reptiles, it underlines a great truth, that in their souls resides the Creator. When there are bonds of love between a soul and the Creator, there are also with creatures. The first is a proof of the second, as the holy author of the Divine Ladder would say. Seven, his renown. From the time he was a simple hero monk, Father Athanasios was renowned all over the holy mountain. When he ascended the abbatial throne, his brilliance shone much farther. Many people visited Grigoriou monastery for no other purpose but to meet him. Some were seeking spiritual guidance, others came for confession. Not only monks of ATHOS, but also many clergymen and laymen from the world went to confession to him. Up until his death, he refreshed and washed countless souls in the bath of repentance. So many people came to him for confession that the monastery was forced to take measures to protect his quiet a little bit. Persons in high positions in the church and state held in great esteem. Archbishop Chrysostomos Papadopoulos, although he never met Father Athanasios in person, he greatly revered him and never lost an opportunity to send him greetings and embraces and ask his blessings and prayers. King George II, when visiting the Holy Mountain, stayed for 2 or 3 days at Grigoriou Monastery. He met Father Athanasios there and was impressed by his spiritual stature. It is reported that they not only talked together for hours, but the king even went to confession to him. The deep reverence of the king for the elder is testified to us by the following incident. Dionysiou, elected as Metropolitan of Ischyros and the Holy Mountain, made his oath of consecration before King George. Then the king said to him, "When you go to your diocese, be sure to visit Grigoriou Monastery on the Holy Mountain in order to meet Hieromonk Athanasios. Kiss his hand on my behalf. For me there is no one else like him. He is a venerable man full of sacred dignity and humility." Indeed, Metropolitan Dionysiou, whose spiritual descent was from ATHOS, visited Grigoriou Monastery and asked for Father Athanasios, who had by then resigned his abbacy. With great devotion, he held and kissed his right hand, conveying the royal greeting. Father Athanasios also took care to kiss the hands of the Metropolitan with the humility of a simple believer. When Father Athanasios was an old man, the patriarchal exarchate, who was passing by Grigoriou Monastery, persistently asked to see him. At the pleading of Elder Bessarion, the elder agreed to come out of his cell. The bishops, ran to kiss his hand, expressing their deep reverence before him. The head of the exarch, the Metropolitan of Heliopolis, began to eulogize him. "We have heard so much about you, and we wanted to meet you. We are so happy. You are a holy man. May we have your blessing." Through all this barrage of praise, Father Athanasios sat silently with crossed hands. The only words that finally came from his lips were, "I am unworthy." With that, he bowed down before them, bade them farewell, and retired to his cell. Part 5. A Bright Sunset. 1. In the quiet of his cell. As the years passed, Father Athanasios became even more inward and compunctionate. So great was his compunction that he would shed tears at the mere mention of the name of Christ, or of an incident from his earthly life from the Gospel. His inner strivings were elevated to the highest degree. He systematically avoided communication with visitors, and would press his lips shut in order not to lose the treasure of silence. For one whose love for God surpasses the usual limits, it is absolutely essential to have a quiet place where he can worship Him unceasingly. For Father Athanasios, that place was his cell. Released now from his responsibilities as abbot, he could fish for divine pearls in the sea of Hesychast given him by God. Except for the hours of services in the church and trapeza, he was always found in his cell. When the weather permitted, however, he would visit 2 other of his beloved places. In the morning hours, he would go east to a garden that had a small cave in it. It was formed by 2 rocks and was surrounded by olive trees. In front of it lay the vast Aegean Sea. 100 meters below, the waves pounded ceaselessly against the rocky shore. In the afternoon hours, he would go north to a great ravine above the harbor, where he had made a seat for himself by placing a plank on 2 rocks. He experienced many sacred moments at these 2 places. Mainly, however, his cell was the arena, where he was to engage in the final round of his spiritual wrestling. Here he would ponder about death and the vanity of this present life. Here he would make his final spiritual ascents. All who passed by his cell perceived that the elder conversed with God. He could never have enough prayer. He also studied the sacred texts, but his first priority was prayer. His mind soared very high, and he experienced the beauty of the spiritual world. His soul was encircled by the immaculate powers who are hidden in God and fragrant with beauty beyond thought. Dionysiou the Areopagite. The sweetness of the cell of which the fathers speak had become his possession. Any discerning man seeing him perceived that before him was a man completely absorbed in the world of God. Every monk is obligated every day to do a certain number of prayers and prostrations with his prayer rope, the komboskini. This is what is known as his kanona, or his rule. Father Athanasios, who gave himself over to prayer so much, in this point also surpassed the usual bonds. During 3 years, he exceeded the prescribed rule. "I can go to bed later. Why don't I do a little more now while I can?" he would say. His love and veneration for the Lady Theotokos was beyond limit. The rejoice of the ATHOS hymn resounded from his cell every day. Her icon, which adorned his poor cell, was the constant recipient of his veneration and kisses. The child Jesus he kissed on the feet, the Theotokos on the hand. Today, those who visit the cell of Father Athanasios can make out the abundant traces of his kisses on this icon. He also had sacred ties with other icons of the Theotokos. In one of his notebooks, he inscribed the following lines: "In our beloved monastery during the services, I stand in front of the sweet icon of the Theotokos in the iconostasis, which looks as though it were alive. Only her speech is missing. Her sweet but sober gaze follows you everywhere. Oh, how I delight in the contemplation of her holy icon. I seem to have before me the very Theotokos." He attached so much importance to the ATHOS that he wouldn't even tonsure anyone who didn't know it by heart. In his handwritten notes, he had copied from spiritual books passages extolling the greatness of the ATHOS hymn. We quote a few. Accustom yourself to reading with extreme devotion her ATHOS, and you will see in time how much grace you will receive. Something I say to you that perhaps you have not tasted, but taste and see. Do not expect to see this from the first, because a vine does not bear grapes as soon as it is planted. With time you will gather most sweet and ripe grapes. Knock continuously at the gate of her motherly compassion and love for mankind with the incessant knocking of her ATHOS and her hymns of praise, and you will find help and protection, not only in this transitory life, but also at the hour of your death. Truly, his cell had become paradise. When the fathers knocked at his door for any need, when he opened it, they would see his face covered with tears and shining with divine joy. If they informed him that there were visitors wanting to see him, he would try to avoid such a meeting. The unseen and silent life of his cell was more dear to him. He was able to say, together with St. Simeon the New Theologian in his hymns of divine love, "You satisfied me by the means of the cell, in which solitude I was enclosed. You set me free to be with God, the only lover of man. No one knocked at the door, no one gave voice." Two, spiritual alms. The author of this book had the great blessing of God of meeting Father Athanasios 3 years before his death. I had been visiting St. Anne's Skeet, and I was returning. I passed by Grigoriou Monastery and asked for Father Athanasios. After much persistent pleading, he consented to see me. When I saw him, I testified that I was immobilized by the radiance of his face. I saw a holy figure that seemed not to belong to our time, tall, thin, white-haired, yet with a childlike face. He welcomed me and spoke to me with great love. His spiritual maturity was evident. We were together for 20 minutes. During that whole time, as was his custom, he kept his eyes cast down. I don't remember that he looked at me more than 2 or 3 times. "Elder," I said, "please give me a word, as I am a new clergyman living in the world and have so many spiritual needs." "There are men here on the Holy Mountain who possess much virtue and spiritual wisdom. If you visit them, you will receive much benefit," he answered. "Who are they, Elder, who you think are in a position to help me?" I asked him. "If you are going to St. Anne's Skeet and Katounakia, go and see Father Daniel. He is a very cultivated man and was a disciple for many years. You will receive much from him," he answered. Both out of humility and love for solitude, Father Athanasios was accustomed in his last years to recommend other elect fathers of the Holy Mountain to people seeking advice and confession. "Elder," I said, "I've just returned from St. Anne's and I am going back out in the world. That's why I would like to receive something from you as spiritual alms." At these words of mine, he paused for a moment, then with a voice full of kindness and sweetness said, "Since God has made you worthy to become a priest, take care to participate in the divine liturgy with your whole soul. During the time a priest is celebrating liturgy, he should feel a lamp burning within him. He should keep that lamp unextinguished until the next liturgy. From the first to the last liturgy, the priest must keep the lamp kindled. And be careful. After liturgy, withdraw somewhere and in silence experience whatever you've been given. Avoid speaking and never laugh after the divine liturgy." Here he terminated the discussion. He arose and warmly bade me farewell. After I kissed his hand, we parted. "May Christ protect you," were his last words. I consider myself fortunate to have this heavenly meeting and inestimable advice. When Father Athanasios was asked about the value of the monastic life, he would answer, "Monastic life is the greatest gift God has given to man." And to someone who complained about pain and illness, he answered, "With sickness, Christ visits you, my child." He possessed the virtue of charity in abundance. To his successor as abbot, he gave the following advice. "The abbot must be very charitable, as was St. Nicholas, and must assist all who come to the monastery asking for help. God will never forsake anyone, but will provide so that nothing is lacking." His soul loved the spirit of angerlessness and meekness very much, and he made special efforts to instill it in his disciples also. He even became a poet and gave them verses to read dedicated to holy meekness. A certain Grigoriou monk at the Matokian received the following poem, quote, "Sweet it is, most sweet of all, to be meek and gentle. When a man abuses me, why should I insult him? Will his fury ever cease if I return his curses? His anger carries him away, and I respond in kind, till through his harsh word ferocity I am brought low. In the hour of passionate rage I shall hold my peace. The madness will cool and pass away if I let it end with me. Afterwards by peace and sweetness do I strike the unjust one, and I am better heard by him than if I had struck back in wrath." To one of his spiritual sons who had renounced the things of this world and set out to become a monk, he wrote, "I was exceedingly overjoyed that you have auspiciously arrived at the spiritual harbor of the Theotokos. In order to make progress in the godly monastic way of life, you need to lay down a good beginning, a good foundation and groundwork. The first foundation is exile, which you've already laid down." That was signed in 1931. The following excerpt is from a letter addressed to a young scientist whom my father Athanasios had close brotherly ties. "Brother in Christ, my heart was filled with joy and delight at the news of your receiving your diploma. What I would advise you, according to my strength and understanding, is keep in your mind the unlying words of the Lord, 'Without me you can do nothing.'" The following observation, another extract from a letter, shows great psychological insight. "Your sickness, my child, does not seem natural, considering that the doctors were hardly able to help you at all. I believe it is something hidden in your heart." Father Andrew, a young monk of Grigoriou, served for a time at the Matokian. By necessity, spiritual communication with his elder was through correspondence. The disciple reported his problems, and the elder would send him healing prescriptions. "Study, my child," he wrote in one of his letters, "to acquire in your life dignity, simplicity, understanding, continuous prayer, manliness, unfeigned love, wisdom, seemliness. Be sympathetic, love the poor, attain silence and patient endurance. Do not slander, do not laugh at anyone. Acquire angerlessness, modesty, and humility so that the Lord will glorify you before the angels and the saints." Here the wise elder sounds like a veteran mountain climber, pointing out to his young pupil the holy heights that he must set as the goal of his life. Father Theoklitos of Dionysiou tenderly remembers the elder's spiritual avowals. "What an excellent thing, Father Theoklitos, to awake at midnight and begin the service exclaiming slowly, 'Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy upon us.'" As he was addressing these words, Father Theoklitos continued, "With his voice and face full of expression, he gave you the impression that he lived in a higher spiritual world, free from remorse and feelings of guilt, peaceful and passionless. He moved in higher spheres, and he carried his fellow converser away to them as well." 3. Divine Revelations. The life of a monk is at a midway point between the temporal and the eternal. He lives on the earthly side of life, but also tastes bits of heaven. To a monk who lives according to his consecration with consistency, laboring on the road of asceticism, and patiently enduring the burning heat of the day and the frost of night, God sends, as the Holy Fathers assure us, divine consolation and heavenly joys. As St. Hesychast writes, "For the monk who comes to divine revelations and visions and becomes wholly enlightened and wise, the labor of the struggle is also intensified." There are many indications that to Father Athanasios also God granted these divine blessings. For example, we mentioned his attendance at the Holy Altar. The other fathers managed to extract from him that at times, when his mind was immersed in prayer, he heard sweet, heavenly psalmodies that had no likeness to anything on earth. At the persistent entreaty of certain fathers, he once confessed that at times he saw, quote, "various mysteries, but he never revealed them to anyone." At one time in the Catholicon, he was made worthy to see with his eyes the protectress of the monastery, Saint Anastasia, whom he greatly revered. He saw her at a young age, dressed as a nun, with unspeakable grace and dignity in her face. Once during a vigil in church, the fathers saw him leave his stall and fall down to the floor in worship. They were surprised, since it was not at the time during the service that would warrant prostrations. When he arose, they saw that his face had changed. What had happened? No one could find out. Only toward the end of his life did he reveal it, the persistent questions and entreaties of the then-current Abbot Bessarion. "My child, since you insist on asking me, I will tell you. I don't know whether my eyes were opened or closed, but I saw, as it were, a vision of the Theotokos, she who is more spacious than the heavens, full of glory and incomparable majesty. The whole of me trembled before such heavenly greatness, and I fell down to worship her." Thus, after many years, the fathers learned for what reason he had surprised them at that vigil. After so many years and insistent entreaties. In the same way, we see in the Holy Scriptures that the Apostle Paul confessed to being carried up to the third heaven only 14 years after the event. Those who freely enumerate the visions they supposedly receive from God are invariably found to be in delusion. 4. On a bed of pain. In 1949, the elder was seriously ill and confined to his bed. The arthritis, which tormented him in his last years, aggravated his condition greatly. Troubled, the fathers suggested that he go to Thessaloniki for treatment, but he would not agree to this and patiently bore the distressing pain. The serenity and sweetness never left his face. Going to and from his cell, the brothers watched the progression of his disease with anguish. When he had previously become sick, Father Athanasios had avoided the help of doctors and medicines, such as the quinine and the cupping glasses which were used then. He regarded his illnesses on a higher plane. He never asked them to prepare him salt-free food, but ate whatever was served at trapeza, in spite of the fact that it made his arthritis worse. In place of doctors, diets, and drugs, he gave himself to prayer and frequent Holy Communion. His dangerous illness happened to coincide with Great Lent. The fathers were insistent that he forego fasting, as he was already exceedingly weak. He would not agree. All he asked for was to be given frequent Holy Communion. His condition did not improve. The eve of the Saturday of the ASCETICS arrived. Father Athanasios, who even during the crisis of illness never failed to arise every night and sing the ASCETICS to the Mother of God. He seemed optimistic. He prepared himself for Holy Communion. "I am going to pray all night to the Mother of God," he told the fathers. "In the morning I will come to the Divine Liturgy. I will receive Holy Communion, and possibly then die. It might be, however, that the heavenly bread will work a miracle." The fathers brought him to the church, while he had not visited for a long time. At the end of Divine Communion, they brought him to the Holy Chalice, and he communicated. His hopes had not deceived him. The Divine Eucharist brought joy, health, and gladness. His health was restored, and his life again resumed its normal rhythm. The bread of life had worked its miracle. In 1951, Father Athanasios was again confined to his bed. He felt his strength abandoning him and asked to be given holy unction. After the service of the sacrament, he thought to give the fathers who were present as a gift a small blessing. He portioned out to each one of them something of what he had in his cell. "I wish you a good paradise," he said to them. "There is our eternal dwelling. Here we are temporary." Later he gave the abbot many books. He only retained the Ladder of Divine Ascent and the Evangelinos. He also kept one Epitrachelion, because if his strength did not entirely forsake him, he would still receive people for confession. His time for departure had not yet come, however. The Lord granted him 2 more years of life. Doxa tau Theo, glory to God the Father. He has left Papu with us for a little while longer. 5. A peaceful end. Many times Father Athanasios had come near to death, and in the last moment been saved. Now, however, his earthly course was ending. In December of 1953, having reached his 80th year, he again became bedridden. He was unable to go to church for the Nativity of our Lord. Everything indicated that he was leaving this earth. His last days were preeminently holy. He refused any kind of food and was nourished only by the Immaculate Mysteries. His mind and heart were completely immersed in prayer. Sometimes he lifted up his hands and gave a blessing as if he was serving the Divine Liturgy. 2 days after Christmas, the elder bade Father Artemios, the father who cared for the aging monks, gather the brethren around him. He wanted to bid them farewell for the last time because he foresaw that his end was very near. Shortly they had all gathered together. He was their spiritual father, their elder, their Geronda, who stood in their life as a bright pillar and guide in the divine life, just as the ever-shining stars are to the helmsman, as St. Gregory of Nyssa says. Therefore was deep grief written on their faces now that they saw he was leaving their midst. Elder, the abbot said, his voice breaking with emotion, if you find boldness before God, and you without fail will, do not forget us. If I find boldness, I will keep you in my sight, both you and all of the fathers, and I will remember you. The atmosphere was strained with emotion. Each one strove to control his sorrow and pain. Now let us come and forgive each other, said the bedridden elder. Everyone kissed him and bade him farewell. May we have your blessing, Geronda. Good paradise. May we meet in heaven. The next day, in the early hours after the Divine Liturgy, he felt somewhat better. He was able to care for himself alone. He got up, washed himself, and put himself in order. The clothes that he took off, he gave to Father Artemios. I don't need these anymore. Do whatever you want with them. One of the younger monks, seeing that he was better, took the opportunity to confess to him and discuss certain of his problems. He even found the courage to ask him, Elder, in what way were you informed that your repose is at hand? My child, I leave tonight. That is the truth. But don't ask me how I was told. In the afternoon he summoned the abbot. In a few hours, he said, either before or after Compline I will depart. As for you, look after the brothers, and the Virgin will never forsake you. Go now and bring the Immaculate Mysteries so you can give me communion. Then he addressed Father Andrew, the monk who dressed those who reposed. Father Andrew, you don't need to change my clothes. I have prepared myself. Leave me clothed as I am. When the abbot returned with the Divine Eucharist, Father Athanasios began to stammer, Of thy mystical supper today, O Son of God, receive me. Those were his last words. After Holy Communion, he gave himself up to silence and prayer. Often he raised his eyes upward and whispered something. He also raised his hands several times and gave the priestly blessing. Evening drew near. He began to shiver violently and grew cold. It seemed that the great moment was near. After Compline, all the fathers gathered around him. With tears in their eyes and their komboskinis in their hands, they prayed fervently. The scene was reminiscent of the holy icon, which portrays the blessed repose of Saint Ephrem the Syrian. At that time his face was very peaceful and radiant, and it shone like yellow amber. It was the prelude of the blessedness of heaven. He was unable now to lift his hands. He crossed them on his breast, and he closed his eyes. And shortly, with an otherworldly serenity and peace, he gave up his spirit into the hands of God. So quiet was the flight of his soul toward heaven that no one was aware of the moment of its passing. Such quiet death was the seal and confirmation of his silent and peaceful life. Death did not erase his image from the hearts of his disciples. On the contrary, it enshrined him there, longed for and radiant. Many times in their dreams they would see his unforgettable and venerable face. Some saw him shining amidst a wonderful light, others beheld him in an honored place, yet others saw him liturgizing with glorious vestments in a magnificent church of majestic proportions. And he was also seen coming with authority to pull people out of difficult situations. These were blessed dreams, gifts of grace. How could they forget such images? The blessed elder Athanasios was without a doubt fashioned in gold and adorned in precious stones. May the radiance of his precious stones of virtue and grace inspire each reader of his life to spiritual victories like his own. Amen.
Elder Callinicus the Hesychast, a disdainer of things below and a stranger on earth, a lover of things above and citizen of heaven. Unknown source. A reading from Contemporary Ascetics of ATHOS, written by Archimandrite Cherubim. Chapter 1, Pious Yearnings. 1. His early years. Father Callinicus was born in Athens in 1853. His parents were pious people, descendants of military officers who took part in the Revolution of 1821. He passed his first years in what were then the outskirts of Athens, becoming steeped in piety and Christian tradition. Their Orthodox faith was a characteristic feature of the men of that age, and there were few who were indifferent to God and the Church. Constantine Theospris, this was his name in the world, was a lively and intelligent child who was devoted to the Church. He loved ardently the reading of Christian books and never missed an opportunity to attend the divine services of the Church. He took part frequently in all-night vigils, so as to enjoy their spiritual wealth. Everything he heard in the sermons and read in books, he stored up wholeheartedly in his soul during these vigils, and he enjoyed in truth a spiritual banquet. In his restless, youthful soul, however, there still remained a certain void which all these activities could not fill. He yearned for something higher, something stronger, which he couldn't find in Athens. But he didn't know whether or not this indefinable yearning could be satisfied by a life completely dedicated to God. At this opportune moment, he made the acquaintance of a certain person who was knowledgeable about life on the holy mountain. Thus he learned in detail how the fathers of ATHOS lived the divine monastic life. The deep waters of his soul were troubled. Anxiously he turned east to the holy mountain. There he believed he would find what he was looking for. A certain day in 1875 found Kostas wandering about the harbor of Piraeus, examining the sailboats at the pier. He had made an important decision, and his lips stammered, "My God, if it is thy will that I go to live on the holy mountain, show me the boat which will take me there." Going to each in turn, he asked about the routes of the boats. He was beginning to despair of finding the answer he sought, when suddenly his face began to beam. There was one boat whose destination was ATHOS. Fervently he begged the captain to take him, promising to help in whatever way he was able during the voyage. At first the captain refused, but he finally yielded to the youth's persistent entreaties. Kostas bade farewell to Piraeus. Full of joy, he gave thanks to God for his providence. The boat which he had sought had been shown to him, and the desired journey had become a reality. Chapter 1, Continued Pious Yearnings. 2, to Iveron Monastery. The sailboat would go to Iveron Monastery, where it would take on a cargo of timber. Several days were needed to reach there, for voyages were slow in those days and not without difficulties. During the journey, Kostas gained the respect of all on the boat by his behavior. Only when someone out of curiosity would ask him about the object of his voyage would he avoid answering. They saw before them a charming, likable, energetic, and relatively well-educated youth. He had finished secondary school, and they refused to believe that such a handsome young man would shut himself up in some monastery of the holy mountain. But the curiosity and questions of his fellow travelers did not weary him so much as something else. Sitting in a corner of the boat, he was attacked again and again by wavering thoughts. This temptation greatly tormented him. He was reminded of his picturesque Athens, his house, his parents, his brothers and sisters and loved ones from whom so mercilessly he had separated himself, and who would be very upset as soon as they realized he had left. Besides this, he thought of the many difficulties which awaited him where he was going, among unknown people who lived in privation and hardship. "Don't you pity your youth?" his thoughts said to him again and again. "Where are you burying it?" When he sighted from afar the peak of Athos, however, These thoughts began to subside, giving way to an enthusiasm which utterly overpowered him. In a short time, one by one, the various monasteries appeared, spread out here and there at the feet of Athos. All that he had heard or imagined about the holy mountain came to life before him. His contrition and joy reached their highest pitch as they drew near Iveron monastery. With their boat approaching the shore, Kostas took just enough time to thank the captain and leapt out to run to the monastery. He had read about the wonder-working icon of the Mother of God, the Portaes Thaisa, the gatekeeper, which resides at Iveron. Kneeling before her majestic icon, he asked for her protection in this new life. Because of his devotion, it is no wonder that the grace of the All-Holy Lady came to meet him. Chapter 1, Pious Yearnings. 3. In the Desert of Katounakia. After being a guest for a few days at the monastery guest house, Costa began to think about where he should stay. Should he stay there, or should he set out for somewhere else? When he found out that the monastery was idiorhythmic, which naturally made him uneasy, he decided to search for a place that would be more hesychistic. He was told that if he desired the hesychistic life, he should visit the desert of Katounakia. The greatness of the ascetics living there astonished him, and so, wasting no time, he soon reached the skeet of St. Anne, and walking further, reached Katounakia. Katounakia is a wild and rocky region on the south side of Athos. It, together with the neighboring desert regions of Kafsokalivia, St. Basil, Little St. Anne's, Kouroulia, and as far as Vigla, the final projection of the peninsula into the Aegean Sea, comprises the holiest area of the mountain. If we think of the holy mountain as a temple, this area would be the holy altar. Even today, one who is seeking men who live mightily for God and who have advanced in the life of holiness will find many here. When young Kostas arrived at Katounakia at the end of the last century, these areas were indeed thickly planted with lilies blossoming in the desert. The young admirer of the ascetic life, searching for an elder virtuous and austere in his way of life, found the elect hesychast, hero monk Daniel. Chapter 2, Life in the Desert. 1. Father Daniel. To a most inhospitable part of Katounakia, to a place not much higher than the sea, Father Daniel came in about 1870 to practice the ascetic life. With much toil and sweat, he was able to build there a temple dedicated to St. Gerasimos, the new, and also 2 small rooms. He would spend the rest of his life here in his desert cell. Father Daniel was from Zagora, near Mount Pelion, and had previously held the care-laden and burdensome office of abbot of Grigoriou monastery. Now, however, he was numbered among the inhabitants of the desert community of Katounakia, and gave thanks to God for the silent refuge he had given him. With his whole soul he was devoted to the life of silence, which gives the heart assent to God, and with wings like a dove's inflames also the longing for divine Hesychia. History of the Monks of Syria. The steps of the youth Kostas were directed to this elect hesychast, renowned as a virtuous spiritual father, so that he could give over his soul into the hands of this elder, as into the hands of the Lord. Elder Daniel could not believe that this well-mannered young man with an Athenian education could endure the life of the desert. Naturally, therefore, he did not quickly assent to accept him as his disciple. Kostas, however, would not bend. He begged persistently to be accepted. "Only test me, Yarunda," he said, "and if I don't please you, then send me away." Even while refusing Kostas, the elder prayed and asked for divine enlightenment. He waited for God to inform his heart whether or not this boy could endure the heavy cross of the eremitical life. At last he decided to accept him under his spiritual guidance and protection. 2. The Spirit of the Desert. Whoever finds himself at the cell of St. Gerasimos feels intensely the otherworldly magnificence of the desert. The sea lies at a short distance below his feet, and in bad weather the din of the waves striking the rocks of the precipitous shore is clearly heard. Sheer cliffs, reaching a height of up to 300 feet, rise in grandeur above the cell. Here and there can be distinguished the scattering of hermitages of other ascetics who, for the love of asceticism according to Christ, have gone afar off and dwelt in the wilderness. There, a little further up, the elders Daniel, Gerasimos, and Father Ignatius, all renowned for their virtue and wisdom, lived in asceticism. In the region around the cell, if one examines a hollow now used for storing wood, he will discover 4 or 5 steps leading to an underground, or rather spacious cave, which shows clear signs of being an ancient eschaterion. It is a place where the ascetics labor. What feelings seize you when you think that you are surrounded by such ancient strugglers? Again, rising your glance to the northeast, you can see in the distance the full grandeur of the summit of Athos. The majestic peak, the wide expanse of the Aegean Sea, the jagged rocks, the scattered hermitages, the harsh scrub. All these create an atmosphere confirmed and deepened by the absolute, undisturbed Hesychast. Being enraptured by his surroundings and remaining at the side of the experienced and cultured elder Daniel, our young renunciate of the things of this world felt himself to be the happiest of youths. When he looked at his spiritual veteran, his gray-haired elder, he wept from enthusiasm and contrition. He was prepared to conform completely to his elder's counsels. Chapter 2, Life in the Desert Continued. 3, Privations and Difficulties. Kostas, my child, here we have only 1 meal a day, and that without oil. And we have oil only on weekends and feast days. We pray most of the night. We sleep little and must do our handiwork in the daytime so that we may earn our bread. May it be blessed, elder. This is the life I have longed for. If I had wanted a different way of life, I would have chosen a Cenobitic monastery or skeet. We have no spring here, Kostas. The water collected in our cisterns must be used with great care. Among these rocks it is impossible to have a garden, and so we taste neither fruits nor vegetables. We feed ourselves with a few wild greens, olives, sometimes with beans, or with a fig, or whatever else can be brought from the store in Daphne. And in place of fresh bread, we eat rusks. Bread which is left over from trapeza in the monasteries of the Holy Mountain is dried and distributed to the hermits. Father Daniel was supplied with this dried bread, or rusks, by Zeraputamu Monastery. While Kostas listened attentively, and the elder continued to describe the difficult conditions of his new life. Kostas, we have here neither milk, cheese, nor eggs. At Pascha we have no red eggs to eat. One that is preserved from year to year is brought out so that we may see it and remember the feast. Kostas listened with great interest and attention. Not bathing was another hardship of this new life. Both bathing and washing were to be forgotten. This practice, perhaps somewhat curious at first sight, is a part of the anchoritic life, for reasons of self-denial. As Kostas said himself, his rarely washed undershirt became like a thick woolen saddle blanket. The following incident gives a very moving glimpse of the difficult life at Katounakia. Several years had passed, and Kostas had become Father Callinicus. One Pascha, a certain charitable monk took pains to get them a little cheese, so this year the Pascha table would be a memorable one. My child, see that the cheese that was given us is also put on the table, the elder said to Father Callinicus. But he was astonished at this, and, being carried away by his ascetic striving, dared to oppose this luxury. What are you saying, Yaronda? Cheese in the desert? Who ever heard of such thing? Well, later, however, his words came back to him. 2 or 3 years had passed, and he had been sorely tired by the difficulties of both obedience and the desert life itself. The fast of Great Lent that year had also exhausted him to the extreme. The fast of the desert dwellers is more austere than that of the other monks. the 3 days, that is the first 3 days of Great Lent, in which a total fast is kept, is usually kept by them for 5 days. And so Pascha arrived. While preparing the paschal table, he confessed his thoughts to his elder. "Now that it is Pascha, elder, what a wonderful thing it would be if we had a little cheese." Smiling, the elder Daniel answered him with the same words Father Callinicus had used years before. "What are you saying, my child? Cheese in the desert? Who's ever heard of such a thing?" Kostas, with his youthful enthusiasm, emerged the victor over the harsh circumstances of his new life. He did not cease, however, from having difficulties, times of weakness, sorrow, and weariness. The elder did not allow him to leave the area of their cell and the surrounding skeet so that his thoughts would not become distracted and disturbed. Such complete estrangement from the world many times brought him a despondency which came to weigh heavily on his heart. Their fasting, which really was closer to starvation, exhausted him greatly at his young age. At these times of exhaustion, the devil showed him vivid pictures of the lavish tables he could enjoy, if only he would abandon the harsh life of the desert. To rise at midnight and pray continually for so many hours, to stand for so long at the all-night vigils, sometimes he felt paralyzed in every faculty and drained of all power of endurance. And the thousands and two temptations of the demons, disordered thoughts, attacks of the imagination, enticing suggestions, how could he endure all this? And again, how could this well-bred Athenian ever become accustomed to never bathing? But he did not bend. With vigorous, manly faith, he courageously confronted all these difficulties, the afflictions and temptations, the myriad of demonic happenings, their arrows and schemings, Nihilus, the desert dweller, which follow after the ascetics. He felt honored and happy that at his age he had been vouchsafed to enter the arena of the desert. Besides, he was not alone. In all his trials he had his venerable elder standing by, ready to encourage him and warm his desire to overcome all obstacles and to advance forward. Chapter 2, Continued Life in the Desert. Elder Callinicus the Hesychast. 4. Wood carving. Like many other desert dwellers, Father Daniel's handiwork was carving. Even today one can find fathers who practice this art in the deserts of the Holy Mountain. This gives them an occupation which both helps them overcome despondency and cover their various expenses. Kostas also learned the art of wood carving from his elder, and by it he obtained the money necessary to meet their needs. He learned how to transform unworked pieces of oak, boxwood, or scrap wood into well-made wood carvings. First he would cut the wood into narrow strips with a handsaw. Then he would sand it smooth. With a pencil he would sketch the design onto the smooth surface. Finally, using various delicate and sharp tools, he would make spoons, combs, paper knives, small crosses, phosphorus seals, or even more remarkable works of art, such as the tender likeness of a saint, or a finely wrought scene from the life of our Lord. Father Daniel had specialized in manufacturing spoons of the highest quality. To emulate him demanded care, diligence, and most of all great patience from his young disciple. The desert had taught Kostas many previously unknown skills. So also in this unusual handiwork, his industriousness enabled him to make outstanding progress. Carved wooden works displaying his amazing artistic abilities have been preserved up to today. One that we have seen belongs now to Archimandrite Arsenios Theodoropoulos of Larissa. It is a blessing cross with scenes from the Holy Passion. Having great physical endurance, Kostas was undaunted by hard work and was able to give himself over to very heavy labors. His vast energy was apparent from the first days of his life at Katounakia. He noticed that the rough and uneven terrain around their cell and skeet tormented his aged elder when he wanted to go somewhere, and he decided something should be done about it. "Yeronda," he said, "I want a blessing to open a path through the thick brush so you and our visitors will be able to walk without difficulty." "May God forgive you, my child," answered the elder, pleased with his disciple's inspiration. The quiet of the desert was disturbed for a few days by the sound of pickaxe and shovel. The wild scrub and rough rocks were cleared away, and there in the midst of the inaccessible and inhospitable wilderness appeared a handsome path. 5. A precious heritage. Costa's good behavior gave Elder Daniel the right, without the least hesitation, to tonsure his disciple, a monk. His new name was Callinicus. The Yeronda wished that the end of his ascetic struggles might be, according to his name, a good victory. Anticipating now his departure from this temporal life, Father Daniel saw with satisfaction that he would be able, without any fear, to place his wealth of hesychistic experience upon the shoulders of Father Callinicus, the weighty inheritance passed on from the great hesychists of former times. St. Gregory the Sinite, traveling to Athos at the beginning of the 14th century, kindled the flame of hesychism there. He taught anew the divinely inspired method which, through the total cleansing of the nous, contemplative assent, and prayer of the heart, or nous, leads one to noetic participation in God. This flame, like a holy pearl passed on from generation to generation, also had been kindled in the soul of Elder Daniel, who now, with mystical awe, resolved to transmit it to his own disciple. From the time he was initiated into the mysteries of noetic prayer and the life of Theoria, Father Callinicus felt a certain tremor like that of Pentecost. To begin with, he had to conquer himself, to look himself straight in the eyes, and without cowardice decide to persecute every dark element, every tear planted by the enemy. Only in this way could he advance further and conquer the heavenly world of Hezekiah, living as Lord in the house of his soul. What joy he felt! What a path was opening before him! What divine light, the light of Tabor in the resurrection, met him as he drew closer to the Father of Lights, who faced him from afar at the end of his path. Now Elder Daniel could leave this world in peace. In 1881, the body of Elder Daniel, wrapped in an old rason, was laid to rest in its final resting place under the earth. The grief of his disciple was indescribable. He was separated from what was most precious to him after God, his elder. With eyes full of tears, he mourned his death. How could he live now without the protection of his spiritual father? This elder had been his spiritual treasury, a bank from which in his difficult hours of warfare he could withdraw spiritual capital. He felt he was an orphan, even as did St. Simeon the new theologian, who lamented the death of his elder with these words, quote, "Thou dost take from this world my father, alas! Thou dost carry away my guide before mine eyes, O lover of men, and thou hast left behind one, wholly orphaned, wholly forsaken." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. His ascetic development. 1. A lover of study. Now Father Callinicus was elder at the Hesychasterion of St. Gerasimos. With him also was Father Neophytus from Samos, who after Father Callinicus had come under obedience to Father Daniel. Father Callinicus's purpose was to preserve, as the apple of his eye, the admonitions of his blessed elder, and to do justice to the golden hopes which he had placed in him. And indeed, by his great struggles, he appeared a worthy heir to this spiritual tradition. Asceticism, fasting, prayer, silence, ordering of the nous, all these were cultivated systematically and with characteristic prudence. In the estimation of the fathers, Father Callinicus was more austere in everything than his elder had been. He had a great love for study and threw himself with all his strength into reading. Even though he hadn't received a higher university education, he was exceptionally sharp-witted and could grasp very difficult writings and comprehend the deepest ideas of Scripture and the Holy Fathers. Next to the Scriptures in importance were the Hesychistic Fathers, Hesychius the Presbyter, Isaac the Syrian, Gregory Palamas, and all who lived in the climate and the spirit of sacred Hesychia were his intimate companions. Their lives and thoughts he aspired to make his own. He would never allow himself, as long as he lived in the same circumstances as they, to be deprived of the fruits with which they were laden. Intelligent and a lover of study, cultivating the talent which God had given him, he set himself the task of mastering the Russian language. And he succeeded in mastering it so thoroughly that he could both speak and write it. This knowledge was important in his life, as we shall see further on. But his great love was the Philokalia. His pure mind searched its pages and met the kindred spirits of those who had chosen the life of vigilance and contemplation, and rejoiced with spiritual gladness. 2. The joy of solitude. In addition to study, Father Callinicus delighted in solitude. In solitude, his mind could draw near to God. We can see this quality throughout his life. Truly hesychistic life without isolation is impossible. The following is an indication of his character. It was sometimes necessary for various reasons to go to Daphne. For these trips, the fathers used the boat. Father Callinicus, however, used a different route, traveling on foot, which caused him great hardship. It took 8 hours of continuous walking to reach Daphne. The lengthy, laborious journey did not frighten him in the least. On the contrary, he especially loved hardship. Moreover, the lengthy solitude suited him. Free from the noise, debates, and talkative persons he would probably have encountered on the boat, he, along deserted paths, enjoyed the presence of God. For the roads, especially when they are lonely, give us an opportunity for reflection, there being no one to disturb us, writes the divine Chrysostom in his 19th homily on Acts. While his footsteps echoed softly in the deep, precipitous ravines, while he ascended high mountain passes or walked through the shady forests that adorned the holy mountain with abundant beauty, he would pray without ceasing. How many times, surrounded by the beauty of the holy mountain and gazing at the broad expanse of the Aegean, he would raise his hands to praise the one who made all things in wisdom, the one for whom his heart longed, that it might possess him forever. 3. A teacher of temperance. The spirit of temperance ruled over his entire life. He himself and his novices lived most frugally. 1 measure of oil lasted them a whole year, and they used it both for food and for the lamps of the church. On weekends, when oil was permitted, he filled a tiny glass with it and threw it into the food, but it was such a small amount that it could scarcely be noticed. Outside his cell, there was a small grapevine that bore about 10 white grapes each season. He never put any of these into his mouth, and he did not even allow his novices to taste them, so that they might learn to cultivate the fruits of temperance. Once, when they were going to be an all-night vigil, the fathers asked him if they could drink coffee. Quote, "If we must keep the all-night vigils with drugs, better we go to sleep," was his answer. Indeed, he himself never drank coffee. During Great Lent, he undertook great fasts. Once, without eating or drinking the least thing, he fasted continuously for 20 days. He scrupulously observed the principle of not bathing. One evening when he was writing in his cell, he fell asleep. The kerosene lamp began to smoke terribly until everything around it was quite black. When they opened the door, his spiritual children were not able to recognize his face because of the smoke. They hastened at once to bring water to wash him, but he stopped them. Wiping his face with his hands, he remarked, "Don't worry, it will go away with sweat and tears." He taught his spiritual children to do the same. Once, when one of them, who for a little while had lived in Larissa, was about to splash a little water on his face, he heard the elder say to him, "If you want to wash, go to Larissa. Here we wash with nothing but tears and sweat." Yerunda Callinicus knew very well the importance of bodily privations. He knew that withered flesh gives no rest to the demons, St. John Climacus, and that a strong mind is a temple of the Holy Spirit, Athanasios. Chapter 3 continued his ascetic development. 4. His humility and loving kindness. At the first glance, his simplicity and humility stood out above everything. He was so humble and plain in dress and so simple in his behavior that he made a profound impression on all who met him. He shunned vainglory in every way. No one was able to persuade him to pose for a photograph. Fortunately, one time a tourist photographed him without his noticing, and so the lens preserved his appearance for us. Because of humility and awareness of the responsibility it would entail, he refused to receive the grace of the priesthood. Quote, "Knowing the responsibilities and the great public office of the priesthood, I have chosen the quiet life of the monk," end quote, he said. His humble spirit shone forth even to the end of his life. He commanded his spiritual children to burn his correspondence, letters of congratulations, encomiums, and other honors that he had received from prominent persons, including the Tsar of Russia, for example. His spirit was adorned with silence, carefulness of speech, and avoidance of all superfluous talk. On the day that he received the Immaculate Mysteries, he shut himself in his cell and did not permit his spiritual children to bother him at all until the evening. But he did not need to lay special stress on the practice of silence, his blessed Hesychiah, because he could not conceive of a Hesychast who lived otherwise, since silence, the mother of prayer, is the spouse of Hesychiah, St. John Callinicus. His kindness had no limits. All who visited him found a man with rich, limitless charity and love. He left his quiet and his prayer and gave himself to their disposal, to their questions and anxieties. He was rightly characterized as a man of rare love and kindness. 5. In seclusion. Possessing such spiritual treasures, Father Callinicus was able to ascend to great heights and to attain lofty visions. He now had 2 spiritual sons, Father Neophytus and Father Daniel, who came from Asia Minor and was vouchsafed to become a priest. Together with 2 spiritual sons, many visitors came seeking his spiritual counsel. On the whole, he was amazingly successful in living up to these demands. However, he never neglected his spiritual life. The unshaken foundation of his spiritual edifice was his constant contact with God. Because of this, many practical considerations began to lead him to a new stage in his monastic life. In 1885, 4 years after the death of his elder, he wanted to take a great step. He made the brave decision to shut himself up completely, to confine himself as if in a prison to his cell and to a small space around it. For however many years God would grant him, he would remain enclosed in these limits. In fact, he lived thus for the remaining 45 years. On no account did he break this principle. When he needed to notify somebody, he used to raise a big pole with a sail on the end like a flag. The neighbors would see it and come to see what was the matter. His sacrifice was great. For 45 years he lived as a recluse in a cell in that desert ravine of Katounakia, depriving himself of ventures out of doors, walks, trips, and all human contact. Only with his death did he leave his enclosure, and even then only his soul departed. His body remained faithful to the physical bounds of his ascetic labors. This heroic step was richly blessed by God. Quote, "Observe how, when a cask of wine is kept still in one place, it becomes magnificent, reaching the peak of its bouquet," as the Philokalia says of Evagrius. His decision was combined with a total devotion to the contemplative life of sobriety, to the cultivation of noetic prayer. At this lofty state that few are worthy to attain, the practical life has no place. Action gives way to theoria. Business and handiwork flee before it. From that time, Callinicus the Hesychast did not busy himself with wood carving. Abba Isaac the Syrian blessed those who have received the higher spiritual state. "Blessed," he writes, "is he who remains in Hesychiah and is not thrown into confusion by the multitude of his works, but turns all bodily actions into the toil of prayer. End of quote. From St. Isaac's Ascetical Homily, number 23. 6. Hesychistic life. Father Neophytus and Father Daniel, Father Callinicus' two spiritual sons, looked after their elder very attentively to ensure that he had what was required by Hesychia. They took care of all the practical affairs of their skete and cell, tending to the visitors and whatever else arose. They had it as their glory that their elder had attained to such spiritual height that he was worthy, quote, always to arise through noetic activity and be raised up by the divine powers, and of quote St. Gregory of Nyssa. The least disturbance of the quiet and the slightest concern put obstacles in the way of hesychistic theoria. Therefore, Father Callinicus saw to it that he lived completely without cares and in the tranquility of nous. Distractions about earthly matters and worldly affairs have no place for him who has adopted a life of wakefulness, nipsis, watchfulness. Therefore, urges St. Nilus the Hermit, do not let the purity of virtue become cloudy through thoughts of things of this world, nor pure contemplation be disturbed by bodily concerns. He never opened his mouth with curiosity to ask his numerous visitors, what is the news from the world? He suppressed every curious disposition, and since he had died to the world, entrusting all things to the providence of God, he considered it inappropriate to take his mind away from spiritual contemplation. Sobriety is goodness and delight, light and sweetness and nobility and a most bright lamp. It is the breathing forth and invocation of Christ Jesus alone, always and forever. Hesychast the Presbyter. Such are the great things claimed for sobriety by its followers. After nightfall, while his spiritual sons rested, he continued in absolute hesychia until the midnight hours. He cultivated in his cell, 60 meters distance from the rooms of his spiritual sons, the divine work of prayer. At midnight, when his spiritual sons began the prescribed service in the church, in accordance with the usual typicon of the Holy Mountain, he rested a few hours until morning. He usually attended the church of St. Gerasimos once a week, when he had Holy Communion. Even though he had abandoned practical occupations, sometimes he remembered the cooking. His disciples used to have the wood and other necessities ready, and he, by himself in silence, prepared their frugal meal, boiled rice as a rule, while he continued unceasingly in the prayer of the heart. But he ate the meal apart from his disciples. Thus he would be alone and praying, saying, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, noetically with every mouthful. These are the outlines of Father Callinicus' hesychistic life. His spirit was illuminated, quote, by brightly shining rays of divine beauty. Callistos Kataphagotis, a writer in the Greek Philokalia, Volume 2. This divine illumination was granted to the Holy One. It came to him and through his influence to his spiritual sons. Even their bodies were illumined, so that, quote, they also shone forth and became another light, for they shine with their own brilliance, St. Basil the Great. 7. Father Callinicus' spiritual sons. Before receiving anyone into his community, Elder Callinicus would test him thoroughly. It was not an easy matter to become his spiritual son, especially if one did not have great spiritual endurance. He spoke little and was exacting in his demands and orders. If a novice did not follow his commands faithfully, he would not stay with him very long. Father Callinicus would say to him, get up and go. I'm not going to sin because of your disobedience. If he tolerated some disobedient person for a time, he did so because he foresaw his future correction. And with his admonitions and appropriate examples, he brought him into the right way. He could have had a great number of spiritual sons, for many came to him. However, because of the asceticism of his life and his austerity, few remained. The virtue and renown of Callinicus the Hesychist drew the attention of Spiridon Menangius to the monastic life, in 1920. He was a great personality, a wealthy aristocrat, a famous chemist, a graduate of the University of Zurich. He abandoned all, sold his possessions, and became Father Gerasimos, the spiritual son of Elder Callinicus. See about him in Two Contemporary Saints by Father Erastos the Monk, pages 37 to 94, published in Athens in 1963. Thus, together with the two spiritual sons that we have mentioned, a third now was included in the community of Father Callinicus. Later on, when Father Neophytos and Father Daniel had reposed, Father Gerasimos had gone away because of health considerations. Geronda Callinicus for a period of time remained alone. From the many people who came to him one after the other, Athanasios, Iosif, the deacon Gerasimos, Christodoulos, Arsenios, few were accepted as spiritual sons. Even Father Gerasimos Menangias left around 1925, for the humidity before the sea forced him to live in the drier climate of St. Basil's Skeet. 8. The management of his spiritual sons. Father Callinicus devoted a considerable amount of time each day, up to 2 hours, to his spiritual sons, who came to his cell in order to enjoy his spiritual wealth. The scene was something quite exceptional. Within the cell of the hermit elder of Katounakia, there was an evening stillness. Confessing their perplexities, thoughts, and problems, his spiritual sons extracted the riches hidden in his spiritual treasure house. At the end, they made a prostration, kissed his hand, and after he had prayed, accompanied by his blessing, left to go to sleep. The discussions with his spiritual sons were strictly monastic and spiritual. Topics of other kinds, memories from the past, comments made to pass the time, they had no place. It was impossible to learn, said one of his spiritual sons to us, if the man had a history, parents, brothers, and sisters, etc. He did not mention any of these things. Father Callinicus knew the spiritual benefits that hardships, rebukes, and the cutting off of their wills brought to his spiritual sons, and he handled them accordingly. One of his disciples had gone to Daphne for provisions and bought a beautiful orange. He wanted to gladden his elder and to alleviate his thirst a little bit, which was plagued through continual austerity. Geronda, I brought you an orange, he said to him happily when he returned. But the elder was not pleased at all. How did you get an orange without a blessing from me? You got it doing your will, therefore take it at once and throw it away. In addition, he gave him a rather strict 40-day penance. One of his spiritual sons, who had a bad cold, went to bed sick one evening and passed the night with much difficulty. At dawn he heard the elder, who was aware of his condition, say to him, "Listen, my child, this letter must go to Kyries today. Are you ready to go?" Kyries, the capital of the Holy Mountain, is 8 hours' distance from Katounakia, but Elder Callinicus knew that obedience gives wings. This his spiritual son learned also. For fulfilling his mission well, he received the profits of obedience. On one occasion, one of his spiritual sons had to bring the dry bread that he had received from Zeraputamu Monastery up to their cell from the beach. He asked his elder to bless him to bring the rowboat to a different spot on the beach near their cell, because the landing was too far away and it took a lot of work to carry the biscuits from there. But his elder refused this request. "It's not fitting," he said, "for a monk's life to lack hardship and bodily labor." At one period there was in his cell, beside one very good monk, a certain novice who did not seem very promising. Elder Callinicus tried in every way to bear it with sensitivity. Many times, with exceptional skill, he tried to bring him to correct himself. Once, for example, a visitor asked him, "Holy Father, how can you bear to have the obedient monk next to this other one?" And the elder, in a loud voice, so that the wayward disciple heard him clearly, replied, "Listen to me. I have 2 sacks. One is full of flour, and the other is full of bran. To the obedient one I give flour, and to the disobedient one I give bran." When the negligent disciple heard this, he was shaken and decided to improve, so that he too would be given flour. With such wonderful skill did the man of God shepherd his spiritual sons, being fully aware of his responsibility for their souls. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4, A Radiant Beacon. 1. The Gift of Discernment. The spiritual struggles of Father Callinicus, the purity of his life, and his continuous contact with God through noetic prayer made him a beacon of discernment. His natural capacity for penetration and the sharpness of his mind were extended to an astonishing degree. With the gift of discernment, which few succeed in acquiring, it is possible for a person to penetrate the secret depths of men's hearts in order to separate the wheat from the tares and the light from the darkness, even in the more confusing cases. According to the sacred writings of the latter, discernment is knowledge through divine illumination, the firm possession of the divine will in every occasion, place, and deed, pure perception, and noetic light. Father Callinicus' reputation as a discerning elder attracted to him a crowd of people who wanted their perplexities resolved by a sure answer, one that was enlightened by God. All had recourse to the spiritual bank of Father Callinicus. They came with doubts, personal problems, questions about the interpretation of passages of the Holy Scriptures, and for spiritual profit. All went away satisfied and enriched. Novices, elders, hermits, Cenobitic monks, laymen, lawyers, soldiers, policemen, Greeks, Russians, the entire Holy Mountain, hastened to the solitary Hesychast of Katounakia. Besides the visits, he had no lack of letters. On the whole, he was solely a counselor. Thus it happens always. Discerning fathers are great magnets that attract all who have spiritual concerns. As we shall also see from the following incidences, Father Callinicus possessed the gift of discernment to a high degree. We will also consider cases that show his clairvoyance, when he foretold events that happened precisely as he had said. 2. Divinely illumined answers. A certain monk who was disturbed in soul, stricken with temptations and afflictions, sought refuge with Father Callinicus to find relief. After he had explained his situation, he received a wise admonition. "Listen, my child," the elder said to him. "Take this bucket and fill it with water. Then throw dirt inside and mix it." He did as he was told. "Now, do you see anything inside?" the elder asked the monk. "No, Yaronda, because the water is clouded." The elder continued the discussion for some time. Kind and full of love, Father Callinicus spiritually strengthened the sorrowful monk. After a while, he told the monk to examine the water. It had just now begun to clear up, he observed. The edifying talk continued for yet a little while, and then Elder Callinicus reminded him to look at the water again. "It has become perfectly clear. In the bottom I can pick out some of the little pebbles very easily." The wise elder closed the discussion with these words: "Something of the sort has happened to you too. At the present your mind is like the muddy water. Do not be upset, however. Have some patience, and in 2 or 3 months the trouble and muddiness will settle, and you will see how much clearer and straighter you will think." Things developed precisely as he said. Another time, a monk who was exhausting himself, worrying about a personal matter, started out to see the Hesychast elder. Hardly when he had arrived, however, he found that he was unable to say anything about it. The problem was of such a nature that he had difficulty finding words to express it. He was in a troublesome situation. With his spirit-moved tongue, Father Callinicus began to tell a story. "Once, a monk visited me because of a certain problem. This is the way it was with him." As he talked, he mentioned precisely what his visitor had hesitated to confess. The monk, astonished, cried out, "That is what I wanted to say, Holy Father." From his great joy at being helped out of his difficult situation in such a beautiful way, the monk got up, spontaneously embraced the elder, and lovingly kissed his hands. Not everyone from the world who visited Elder Callinicus and spoke of their desire to become a monk was encouraged to do so. Whenever the discerning Hesychast perceived that the aspirant would not succeed in the monastic life, he dissuaded him and advised him to return to the world and raise a family. In some spiritual conversations, when he detected that the visitor might be wearied by the exalted topic, he brought the discussion down to easier topics. Perhaps, for example, he would say, "What fine grapes this vine has! How I would like some!" There were times, also, when men who had no spiritual concerns visited the hermits only out of curiosity. In the face of their indifference, even he appeared to be indifferent to spiritual talk. He would not assume a pious and compunction manner, but descended to the level of their interest. So he said to them, "How's your work going? How is your vineyard? Are your olive trees producing oil?" Only if the visitor himself turned the conversation to spiritual matters would he quite willingly present to him the treasures of his soul. Whenever he detected untimely, excessive zeal, he would not encourage it. One nun, who consulted him through correspondence, received a rebuke because she fasted excessively. She used to only eat once a week. "This is from the tempter," he wrote to her. "You should follow the middle and royal path." Chapter 4, A Radiant Beacon, continued. 3. Two Aspiring Hermits. Two monks, who prospered as novices in a Syllabitic monastery, set out for the desert with the blessing of the abbot. To prepare themselves for their new life, they sought out Elder Callinicus. One of them was obviously fit for the harsher anchoritic life. The other, who in the world had been a well-bred scholar, seemed as though he probably could not endure a very austere typicon. Therefore the first, moved by love, explained this to Father Callinicus. It was as if he said to him, "Elder, don't give him too much to do. He couldn't handle it." He was careful to keep all these comments secret from the other monk. Elder Callinicus believed that with a little effort, the second monk would also be able to follow the normal routine of a hermit's life, and thus receive from God the corresponding wages for his labors. So when the second monk's turn came, the elder cleverly said the following to him: "You, my beloved brother, had a soft life in the world, and it appears that you will have difficulty in the arena of Hesychia. Do not leave your monastery. Remain there and receive the following rule. When the priest gives you the andidoron, do not eat it right away, but go into your cell and wet the bread with your tears, saying, 'My Lord, I am not thy brave soldier. I am faint-hearted and have not succeeded in following the desert life,' and then eat it." These words of the elder struck the monk like a thunderbolt. His pride was wounded. Turning to the other brother, he accused him. "Did you tell the elder that I have no endurance? I am willing even to die in asceticism and hardships, despite my being called a faint-hearted soldier." And smiling, Father Callinicus said, "Come and see a courageous soldier of Christ." And so he was given just the same rule of life as the first monk. 4. The policeman who was scandalized. A policeman from the garrison of the Holy Mountain had been extremely scandalized by various individuals that he met in the exercise of his office. Confused in soul, he came to the Caliva of the cell, Father Callinicus. "Elder, I'm very disappointed and distressed by the situation here. I had a great desire to come here in order to meet virtuous and holy monks, but I found the opposite. If in this holy place there is so much mischief, what awaits me in the outside world? I came to find virtue and found vice," said the disappointed policeman. "Oh, my beloved one," Elder Callinicus said to him, "virtue is not like washing hung out to dry and Daphne to show off." The policeman was speechless at the wisdom of his observation, which helped him to resolve his problem. "The function of your office," the elder continued, "is not only to witness mischief and evil, but also to try to ferret it out and expose it when it is not apparent. They did not send you here to expose virtue, but to stamp out evil. You forgot that this is your purpose and turned your attention to something else. That is why you are in such sorrow and despair. And do not forget that virtue is something hidden, which is mystically cultivated in the recesses of the heart." The policeman went away greatly edified by the conversation. 5. How a monk was corrected. Not far from the cell of Father Callinicus there lived a monk who every so often caused scandals by his careless tongue. He caused disputes over unimportant words and abused the other fathers with words unfitting for monks. Once this storm touched upon Father Callinicus also. This monk passed by his cell, and for some made-up reason insulted Father Callinicus in an unseemly manner. The Geronda accepted it all. He remained perfectly peaceful, not saying anything. The monk, when he had finished this string of abuse, set out for his cell. Then Father Callinicus taught him a good lesson, the like of which he had never received. He pointed to the church of his skeet with his finger, adding, "Now, brother, go receive Holy Communion." The monk, without giving much thought to these words, went on to his cell. But as soon as he thought about the meaning of what had been said, he was filled with agitation. Truly, how could he dare to receive communion now, without seeking forgiveness from the brother whom he had grieved? And his uneasiness began to increase. Full of anguish and fear, unable to find peace, he returned to Elder Callinicus to fall prostrate before him and receive forgiveness. Thus Father Callinicus knew how, by a few masterful and clever words, to bring to the senses those who were careless. 6. Teaching by similes. In order to imprint the truths that he uttered on the minds of his hearers, he used direct examples. In this method he was unrivaled. When he wanted to draw the monks' attention to the risks that they ran by not being heedful to themselves, he said, "An acrobat walks on a rope stretched out over a frightful, violent river. If he does not pay attention, he loses his life in a wretched death. In precisely this way, the monk is lost who does not continually watch over himself." And when a certain ascetic asked him, "Why do not we, the monks of today, make progress?" he took the opportunity to use a very graphic image. "We do not make progress because 1,002 insignificant details distract us, and we neglect our primary purpose. Our priorities become disordered, like those of a coppersmith who promises you that in 3 days your mattock will be ready, and when you come to pick it up, he says that he did not have enough time to make it. He sets it apart from the others in order to attend to it, and asks you to come for it another day. Meanwhile, various new orders come in, and the mattock is put aside in some out-of-the-way place, and so he cannot even make the second due date. And this story can be repeated time and time again. Many cares bring negligence and forgetfulness, and they leave us stagnant in virtue." Once they asked, "Geronda, there are 2 novices who received a certain order and carried it out, the only difference being that one did his obedience cheerfully while the other grumbled and fumed. What wages will they get?" The Geronda's reply was, "In this case the 2 did the same work, the difference being that the indignant one became much more tired than the other. Yet he will get a rusty 10-cent piece for payment, while the other will get a gold $1. Regarding the graces that God dispenses to true strugglers, Father Callinicus spoke the following truth, to which he gave fresh expression by drawing on a military simile. When a man faithfully struggles to put the commandments of God into practice, then God provides him with spiritual gifts on every great feast day. This is what happens in the army too, when on special days the officers give money or gifts or honorary furloughs to the good soldiers. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. On the summit of Mount Tabor. 1. Divine illumination. To the Hesychast who rightly practices the lofty work of noetic prayer, engrossed like a fleshless angel at the divine throne, God himself in a secret manner makes his appearance within a flood of superessential light, like that of Mount Tabor. This uncreated light, which the humblest are vouchsafed to behold, the same light which shone upon Moses, the 3 disciples on the Mount of the Transfiguration, St. Paul on the road to Damascus, St. Basil the Great, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Simeon the new theologian, Elder Callinicus was also vouchsafed to see and rejoice in repeatedly. Many who visited him during the time that he was receiving these divine illuminations were awestricken by the radiance of his face. Once when he was shut up in his cell, sailing on the mystical sea of noetic prayer, one of his spiritual sons knocked at his door. After a little while the elder opened his small window. "What do you want, blessed one? Ah, why did you interrupt me? If only you knew where I was, if you knew what that light was." And we indirectly marvel at the splendor that shone upon the Hesychast elder. My ever memorable elder, Father Grigoriou, once set out for the cell of Father Callinicus. His enlightened counsel could resolve certain questions that occupied Father Grigoriou. However, when he arrived, he was told to wait, as Father Callinicus, who was at that time applying himself to prayer, would receive his visitors when he was through. My blessed Gerondo waited the entire day, but the Hesychast elder did not appear. Another day dawned, and during its 12 daylight hours, Father Callinicus was so immersed in the realm of noetic prayer that he continued the whole night as well. The 3rd day still found him praying. During the afternoon, my Gerondo, who was still waiting, perceived that his prayer had ended. In a little while, when Elder Callinicus called my Gerondo to him, he found himself in the presence of a remarkable phenomenon. It was indescribable, awe-inspiring. Many years passed, but he was never able to forget this heavenly vision. "Father Joachim," I heard him say one day to that exceptional hero monk of our cell, this from the same skete, "did you see how radiant the face of Elder Callinicus was? How it shone? How it shone! You would have thought that you saw Moses after his descent from Sinai. What radiance, what divine light! What blessed happiness that Father Callinicus was vouchsafed to behold the light of the Holy Trinity during his life. We may hymn his blessedness with the words of St. Simeon the new theologian, from Hymns of Divine Love, number 7. I partake of light, I participate also in glory, and my face shines, as does also his, for whom I long, and all my members become bearers of light. I then become the most beautiful of beautiful things. Amen. Number 2, the most beautiful of beautiful things. Father Callinicus's face, afire with the light of Tabor, would many times shine with the presence of divine grace even outside the hours of prayer. The words of Abba Isaac the Syrian about the equal to the angel Hesychast Arsenios can also be applied to our Hesychast. Quote, in the contemplation of it they alone rejoiced, and the speaking of words became unnecessary. End quote. A weary disciple of Father Callinicus received an order to go to the Great Lavra to work, a 3-hour walk. He started out, but after a little while, being angry and full of resentful thoughts, he turned back in order to make complaints. But what happened? Approaching, he saw the face of his elder full of divine grace, gladness, and the brilliance of goodness. At this spectacle he was disarmed. Tears overcame him, and he began to bewail himself, saying, "O wretched one, the Geronda is working for your salvation by everything he assigns you, and you're angry?" A certain hermit, Father D., recalling a spiritual conversation with Father Callinicus, reported the following words about the grace of his countenance. When he said these things and looked at me with a sweet smile, his face shone, and a flood of joy and exaltation spread over it, as if at that very moment he felt the gifts of grace and was wounded by the love of God. Father Eurasimos, an exceptional monk and renowned hymnographer, for 8 years had Father Callinicus as a spiritual counselor. He related the following. which had taken place one morning when some spiritual uneasiness had brought him up to the elder's cell. "Hey, good morning, he said to me as soon as he saw me. "I was waiting for you." I was astonished to hear that he'd been waiting for me, as I had not notified him of my visit. I felt suddenly shy in his presence and sat down next to him. When I looked at his face, I saw that it was all shining with some brilliance that was of another world. At this sight, I felt in myself an extraordinary joy, and it seemed to me that I sensed some wonderful fragrance. Truly, therefore, Father Callinicus's devotion to and unceasing conversation with Christ, who is more beautiful than the sons of men, Psalm 44:3, not only filled his soul with spiritual grace, but also his external appearance. 3. The struggle against heresy. Elder Callinicus, by his personal experience, had become a profound expert on even the most subtle concepts of hesychism. He was thus in a position to detect and identify any false teachings on these matters. Well, in 1913, among the Russian monks of the Holy Mountain, there appeared the heresy of the name worshippers. The problem arose from certain passages in a book written by the monk Hilarion, who interviewed ascetics living in the Caucasian mountains. This book, with the heretical teaching about the invocation of Jesus, even passed unnoticed by the Synod of the Russian Church. The heresy began to start a serious discord among the Russian monks of Mount Athos, and there was a threat that it would spread far enough to become a real danger. In this critical situation, there was a need for a man able to discern and successfully combat the error. This man was Elder Callinicus. In his memorandum, which reached as far as the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Patriarch of Moscow, with irrefutable arguments, he demonstrated the unsoundness of the views of the name worshippers, who, according to his apt characterization, quote, have abandoned the head and are worshipping the cap, the skouphia. See Elder Gabriel of Dionysiou on the Lauseikion of the Holy Mountain, page 32, Volos, 1953. Continued, everyone unanimously accepted his position. The Tsar, the Patriarch of Russia, sent him congratulations and decorations. These 2 decorations are preserved until this day in the cell of St. Gerasimos. It is even said that the Tsar made the following remark to the Synod of the Russian Church. An entire synod, quote, and you did not perceive the heresy. You had to let a simple monk from the Holy Mountain enlighten you. End of quote. As many as adopted the heresy, around 1,200 Russian monks, withdrew from Athos on a Russian warship. They betook themselves to the Caucasus, where they continued to persist in their views. Number 4, a teacher of noetic prayer. After his brilliant victory over the name worshippers, Elder Callinicus was generally recognized as an authority on the subjects of hesychism and noetic prayer. Whoever had difficulties in these matters had recourse to his wisdom, and whoever seriously wanted to apply himself to noetic prayer asked for his consent. He proved to be an unerring teacher of this heavenly philosophy. In the teaching and transmission of noetic prayer, he was guided by the gospel passage, "Do not give holy things to dogs." He would never teach the secrets of noetic prayer to a monk who was not trained in perfect obedience and in the mortification of his own will, and who had not progressed in active labors and uprooted the passions in himself. He considered another prerequisite for the cultivation of noetic prayer to be absolute quietness and freedom from cares. He said that in the world it is not possible to conduct noetic prayer. Anyone can pray in words, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me." Prayer of words, however, is one thing, and noetic prayer is another. The first is primary school, and the second is the university. He also considered the presence of a teacher to be indispensable. He said that the studying of books is not enough for the mastery of noetic prayer. The living voice of a teacher is required. The teacher must be unerring, experienced, and discerning, and the disciple must depend on him and comply with him completely. He censured greatly men who applied themselves to noetic prayer without passing through obedience or receiving a blessing, but setting out on their own will. He thought that such a person would become deluded. Noetic prayer, he taught, is a promotion, a gift of God to those who succeed in the active exercise of obedience. In order to show how those who enter into the arena of noetic prayer without the normal preconditions fall into prelist, he used an amusing anecdote. A certain Russian Hesychast of Karulia had a great desire to visit the all-holy sepulchre in order to see the holy fire of the resurrection. During one Holy Week, therefore, he went to Jerusalem, and on the eve of the resurrection, without asking anyone, he lodged himself in the most well-placed and prominent position in the church. He did not know that this place was reserved for official persons. It so happened that he was arrested by the sergeant-at-arms. When they discovered who he was and that he had arrogantly seized that place for himself, they sent him away. Thus he was not able to behold the holy fire, and covered with shame, he returned to the holy mountain. Even thus will anyone suffer who sets out for noetic prayer in the light of Tabor without certain indispensable prerequisites. 5. The visit of a blind man. Some visitors who came to the God-enlightened teacher Elder Callinicus underwent great labors to come to him. Such was the blind Father Leonidas, who also practiced the life of sobriety. His hermitage was the Kathisma of St. Simon, belonging to the holy monastery of Simonopetra. He had a great yearning to visit Father Callinicus, and one day, despite his blindness and his age, he had passed his 70th year, he set out for Katounakia in the guidance of his disciple Daniel. The road that he had to travel was rough and uneven, and because of his condition it took him nearly a day in order to make the journey. In the afternoon, as he was approaching the cell of St. Gerasimos, he stumbled and struck his face on a rock and began to bleed profusely. Father Callinicus received him most warmly, and after they exchanged the kiss of Christ, they began to discuss spiritual matters. The blood that you shed, Elder Leonidas, will be reckoned as a martyrdom because of the love of Christ and of the words conducive to salvation which led you to undergo such hardship, he said to him. The discussion lasted several hours. The most beloved topic was noetic prayer. When Father Callinicus' spiritual son brought a tray with refreshments, usually they served water, coffee, and perhaps a fig, Father Leonidas found the courage to ask, "Why, Yeronda, do you not teach him noetic prayer?" Smiling, Elder Callinicus replied, "If I taught him noetic prayer, Elder Leonidas, who would bring us the tray with water to drink? He needs to cut off his will in obedience, and by obedience noetic prayer will also come. Obedience is an indispensable condition for every spiritual ascent." One of Father Callinicus' disciples had received an order to bring manure for the trees. This meant a long trip and a great deal of hard work. Being tired and seeking a few hours of rest, he asked the Yeronda to lessen this task so he could occupy himself more with study and with prayer. The elder, however, did not agree. "No," he said to him, "do your obedience, that way you will gain more. When I shall have departed this life, you will have plenty of time to study, and you will note that in obedience you lived all that is written in the books." 6. Clairvoyance. Oftentimes God speaks mystically in the pure hearts of the saints and gives them knowledge not only about the present but also about the future. This happened many times to the Hesychast Callinicus. A pious lady, extremely wealthy, had great veneration for Elder Callinicus. In her letter, she besought him to pray for her family to the all-holy Theotokos, to protect them from every peril. Indeed, they had an estate at Lavrios, and the journey there by ship was often filled with serious risks. Once, while the ship was headed for the estate, a frightful storm struck them. They thought they would surely be shipwrecked, but finally they managed with difficulty to arrive safely on land. Then the husband, who was not as pious as his wife, began to attack her. "You saw what we went through?" he said to her. "We were looking at death. What about the prayers of that monk from the holy mountain who promised you? Where is his protection?" In a little while they arrived at their country house and found a letter from Father Callinicus that had been awaiting them for some time. They opened it, and what, among other things, did they read? Quote, "A great trial will come to you. You must be very careful, but in the end you will escape, because the all-holy Theotokos will protect you." The husband was thunderstruck, and from that time his respect for Father Callinicus knew no bounds. Well, to the desert dwellers who live in such great privations and have so many wants, God sends what they need in various ways. Sometimes he speaks to the hearts of certain men who can bring them what they lack, regardless of whether they are pious or irreverent, believers or unbelievers. Abba Dorotheus writes about this. Quote, "Moreover, concerning bodily needs, if anyone be worthy of relief, God will inform even the heart of a Saracen, and working through him have mercy on his needs." End quote. In preparation for Pascha, Father Christodoulos, the spiritual son of Father Callinicus, had gone to Daphne to shop. After he started out, the elder said to his other disciple, "Hey, Father Archimandrite, tell him, please, also to get a little preserved roe." Father Archimandrite ran, but unfortunately he was too slow. His brother was far ahead. When the next day came, Father Archimandrite met him upon his return and, exceedingly embarrassed, told him the situation. As soon as Father Christodoulos heard it, he was dumbfounded. Full of amazement, he made the sign of the Holy Cross. "Listen, my brother," he said to him, "and be amazed. As soon as I had done the shopping in the store in Daphne and was ready to depart, the shopkeeper asked me who my elder was. When I told him, he rejoiced. He had heard about the elder and indicated that he respected him greatly. 'So you say,' he replied to me, 'that Father Callinicus is your elder? Please, take him a little gift for the Pascha on my behalf.' And he gave me a large quantity of preserved roe." 7. Spiritual diamonds. "I am distracted, elder," a spiritual son of Father Callinicus once said to him. "Say the prayer, 'Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me,' and the demon that produces distraction will flee." First, purification from the passions is demanded, and only then can one advance in the eremitic life. A vessel that is not clean cannot receive myrrh. Who after death can go into a golden chest? That is, who can become a saint like Saint Nephon, whose relics are kept in a golden chest? He who is humble and thankful in all things. For example, he finds beans at trapeza. Happily he says, "Indeed, I will eat the beans." But whoever complains about everything and seeks his own comfort and his own will, he will not go into the golden chest. Just as the newspapers write about important and official people, kings, ministers of state, dignitaries, and so on, and do not concern themselves with some coal merchant, so also slanderers turn against all who are eminent and virtuous and worthy of honor and respect. Monks who associate with worldly men, if they are perfect, are brought down. If they are imperfect, they experience many falls. And for them the word of David comes true, quote, "They mingled among the nations and learned their works." Psalm 105:34. We must take care to keep ourselves pure of fleshly pollutions. He who falls into bodily sin perceives that God has forsaken him. One who has committed a great offense or even a crime has the boldness to go to church and light the lampadas. But whoever pollutes his flesh does not even dare to venerate the icons. 8. His radiance. Callinicus the Hesychast, so filled with virtues and gifts of grace, was for ATHOS an exceptional blessing of God, a fiery pillar raised in that seaside desert ravine of Katounakia in order to broadcast light to all sailing on the sea of life. People stand out because of their high rank or because their wisdom is revealed before all in its spiritual grandeur. The Russian ascetic Father Parthenios, formerly a general in the Tsar's army, and also Hieromonk Theodosius, formerly rector of a Russian university, visited him frequently. Among others, a certain Russian desert dweller visited him who had been found worthy of the grace of fragrance. When Father Callinicus' spiritual sons noticed it, they drew near him in order to enjoy the sweet odor that surrounded him. Father Athanasios Lavriotis, a renowned physician as well as an eminent and much published scholar, because of his great accomplishments, he was visited by the French Undersecretary Lemonie on a magnificent yacht at the Great Lavra, and also one of those who used to take the advice of Father Callinicus. When King Constantine I, fascinated by the works of the eminent modern Greek scholar Alexander Mordorades, decided to grant him a decoration, the pious writer turned to Father Callinicus. He wrote to his former disciple, Father Eurasimos Menangias, asked him to ask for his elder's opinion, and only when Father Callinicus consented did this noted author accept the royal decoration. In 1913, the Russian religious periodical The Christian published impressions from the Holy Mountain by the Russian Father Panteleimon, a professor at St. Sergius's Theological Academy near Moscow, who had toured it for 6 months in 1912. Among other things, there is also a mention of Father Callinicus, quote, I also met another who, in an astonishing way, combined spiritual experience and prudence with exceptional love and kindliness towards people. He distributed his spiritual wealth very lavishly also to the Russian monks who sought out his words of instruction and his prayers. End quote. Not only monks, but also Russian archpriests hastened to Father Callinicus, as a certain archpriest, Nicholas, who went to him to be advised about his pastoral work. Our own Metropolitan of Tricky and Stegon, Dionysios, as a young monk of the Lavra, was vouchsafed to visit the cell of Elder Callinicus. His elder, Father Zosimas, took him with him to visit the desert of the ascetics, so that he too could profit spiritually. His Eminence says the following about the recluse, Father Callinicus. Quote, he gave you the impression that he was a spirit-bearing and that the grace of God rested in him. You saw a face that was holy, majestic, blessed. He was wholly spiritual man, measured and sober in his words and clear in his thinking, a true ascetic, a citizen of the desert, an angel in the body. Among all those who happened to meet him, Father Callinicus' face remains deeply engraved in their memories. 9. His blessed repose. July of 1930 found the Hesychast elder confined to bed. The time approached for his departure for heaven. The illness led him to remember vividly his ever-memorable Yeronda, Father Daniel, for he observed that his illness was exactly the same as that which had brought his elder to his death. It had held his elder for 15 days, but Father Callinicus, having a stronger constitution, suffered for 40 days. All the fathers were greatly worried when his illness was discovered, for he was their invaluable spiritual guide and consoler. His condition did not appear to improve. All of July passed and August came. It looked like it might take quite a few more days for the end to arrive. The Feast of the Transfiguration arrived, which was exceptional significance for every Hesychast. Only those devoted to the life of divine Hezekiah are able to understand in all its greatness Mount Tabor and the uncreated light, and the words, it is good for us to be here. This holy day was the next to the last day of his life on earth. On the 7th of August, the enclosed Hesychast was about to break the fetters of the flesh and to fly into the boundless spaciousness of Jerusalem above, which is free and the mother of us all, Galatians 4:26. The final hours of his life were preeminently holy, a worthy consummation of his angelic life. He was in a state of mystical exaltation. It was evident that his end was near. A choir of holy monastic fathers was preparing to welcome him. Moved by this divine vision, he said to his spiritual son, "Go, my child, and get the church ready. The holy fathers have come." His joy was indescribable. Those saints whom he loved so much and whom were his models did not forget him at the critical moment of death. At 10 minutes of the hour, before he died, with raised hands, he gazed with amazement upon the glorified saints who welcomed him into the eternal fatherland. "I thank thee, my God, that even if I have done nothing in my life, I die orthodox," he quietly stammered out. After these words, he closed his eyes and, full of blessedness, Callinicus the Hesychast, the recluse, surrendered his spirit to God. A few years later, at the translation of his relics, it was noticed that they bore that sweet yellowish shading that graces the relics of saints. Amen. End of life. May his blessing be upon us.